The night sky was filled with bright stars. Loud screams could be heard in the middle of the mountains. A small house was surrounded by a fence with barbed wire. There were traps on the way to the house, and a child's cry could be heard in the middle of this area. A man's hand took an axe from the wall, and a rat crawled towards them. The hunter stood in the middle of the passage and said that if someone wanted to rob his house, that person was extremely unlucky. He gripped the handle of the axe in his hand fiercely. Hiding around the corner of the house, the muscleman thought that this was no ordinary thief since he was able to dodge all the traps and escape. Vincent swung his weapon and rushed forward. Running into the stable, he realized that there was no one there. The man touched the bridge of his nose and said that he had been hearing phantom sounds since he found out that they could not have a child. Suddenly, his mouth opened in shock, seeing something below. A newborn baby was lying on a haystack. The hunter held the baby close to him, gritting his teeth. He raised his eyebrows and looked at the boy closely. A smile appeared on his face when he heard the baby's heartbeat. Vincent turned around and saw Alina, who asked why it was suddenly so noisy. Then the woman ran up to the baby, looking at him in shock. The man sweated with excitement, looking at the baby. Standing in the middle of the stable, they decided that this was their child now. Colored patterns were visible when the baby opened his eyes and waved his hand. A wind suddenly blew, collecting clouds, from which soon rain began. People stretched out their hands to the drops falling from the sky. The dry land became fertile, and the villagers began to sing happy songs. The fire drove away wild animals. It also protected the village from dangers, and thanks to its mystical powers, peace reigned. The shepherds stood in the field. No one suffered from hunger or thirst anymore. The young man in the black hat sat at the table, still researching for the villagers, who thought such abilities were magical, and so they called him a wizard. The boy placed his hand on the red book about the good wizard. Chiron sat by the tree, smiling at his father. Vincent's cheeks were red with affection. He grabbed his son and spun him around, shouting how wonderful he was and that they could go home to eat. The hunter kissed the boy on the cheek, and he asked how to use magic. They walked through the green forest, and Vincent laughingly asked if it was magic to fell trees with just one swing of an axe. Two boys with a ball in their hand. They watched Chiron. Father and son held hands while Chiron's peers said that he was constantly reading even when they wanted to play. The hunter looked at the boys with tension, who noticed that the skinny Chiron did not look like his father at all, and that he was abandoned by his real parents. Vincent clenched his fist so hard that it began to shake. He began to sweat as he looked at the boy. He was smiling widely, clutching a large book to his chest. The man looked at his son and said that tomorrow they would go to the city together and buy his favorite fruits. A happy expression appeared on Chiron's face while the hunter thought about how he sometimes did not give him enough fatherly attention. He patted the child on the head and decided that he did not care what others said. With his bright blue eyes widening, Chiron decided that he wanted to learn more about magic. A horse-drawn carriage entered the local city of the kingdom of Thormia, Craze. Chiron looked at the city landscapes with a smile. People were selling and buying clothes, walking along the street. Some were buying vegetables, and some were chatting or reading a newspaper. The carriage wheels stopped. The hunter crouched in front of Chiron and asked him to wait for him in Grandpa Martin's shop until he finished his business. The man frowned and reminded his son not to go into dark alleys and not to run into nobles. And the boy replied with a smile that everything would be fine. Vincent turned around from the carriage. Chiron was diligently drawing letters and numbers on the board. Martin thanked the child with a warm smile for his help. The old man, with a kind look, thought that this child was very smart for his age. He closed his eyes and offered them rice with a smile. When Chiron asked if he knew about magic, the boy cried, not understanding how to use magic, and Martin asked if he meant magic. He imagined the child with toys and thought that children's interests included dragons, heroes, mages, and weapons. Chiron smiled warmly, holding a book in his hands. The grandfather raised his finger and said that he didn't know anything about magic either, but there were many books about it nearby. He pointed to a bookstore in the distance. The boy ran in that direction, shouting that he would be right back. Martin picked up the book and laughed, saying that he had also read such stories when he was a child. His eyes widened in horror when he saw the various symbols inside. The title of the book was written on the cover, and the old man realized that Chiron was interested in how to use magic. Someone hit the small child's hand, screaming loudly. The store employee put her fists on her hips and shouted that expensive books were not meant for peasants because they were not sold in ordinary stores. While the child was looking at the shelves in admiration, a customer in a suit came in and asked if everything they ordered had arrived. The woman greeted the butler, who looked away in confusion. Chiron was completely immersed in reading the books, which all seemed the same to him. Chiron left the store and sniffed his hands, which he had washed earlier. Suddenly, he saw a man carrying a box with many books. The boy immediately ran after him, wondering in his mind where this aristocrat got them. Suddenly, the stranger turned the box over and all the books began to fall down. Chiron froze and opened his mouth in shock. In front of him was a garbage dump. He took one of the books with a smile and realized that Vincent was taking it for him from here. Nearby, two girls were talking with smiles. Their dresses showed that they were aristocrats. Chiron remembered how his father told him not to run into aristocrats. He turned around, not understanding why he could not become the same. The child followed the two strangers. Suddenly, someone put a hand on his shoulder and called him. The guard looked down at him and said that children were not allowed to wander alone in this place. There was a lantern hanging on the arch. The man added that behind these gates was the aristocratic quarter. Two guards surrounded Chiron, asking where his parents were. The men looked at each other and came to the conclusion that Chiron was an orphan. Beads of sweat appeared on the boy's pale face when the guards suggested that he might have been sent by bandits. One of them looked at the child and said that he should go with him. Only a brown sweater remained in his hand. The guard panicked, not understanding where the child had gone. Chiron hid behind a flower bed, breathing heavily. He brushed petals and thorns from his hair. Looking at his dirty sweater, he assumed that his father would scold him. Suddenly, he saw a brown shoe in front of him. The boy put it on. His eyes widened when he heard someone discussing magic. Chiron looked up as someone asked a certain principal to show him how to shoot fire. Standing in front of a stone wall, Chiron overheard a conversation between strangers about how they would get scolded at the academy for doing so. Chiron leaned his ear against the wall and heard that learning magic required a lot of knowledge, effort, and money. The child's blue eyes widened, and he assumed that he needed to be an aristocrat to become a mage. A bead of sweat appeared on his cheek when he heard that insight was the most important thing in learning magic. The children opened their mouths in admiration as they looked up. An old man with a long beard asked if any of the students could explain why 1 + 1 = 2. Two squirrels were sitting on a tree. The principal explained that there was a time when people did not know that 1 + 1 = 2. And many scientists worked hard to prove it. Chiron stood by the high wall listening to the stranger talk about how magic had always existed as well, and humans were able to accept and understand it through insight. The boy's eyes widened when he heard that one could become a wizard if one honed their talents. The old man smiled and said that the child behind the wall could become a mage. Chiron pushed himself off the stone's surface in shock, and the headmaster said that he wanted to hear his thoughts. He looked at his hands, wondering if he should run away now. His blue eyes were wide open, and suddenly a thought came to him. The boy quickly began to climb the wall, thinking that he would regret it forever if he did not do it now. He climbed to the very top, breathing heavily. Suddenly, admiration appeared on Chiron's face. Many young mages were sitting around the old man by the tree. Alpheus, the headmaster of the academy, raised his hand and asked if the child wanted to join him. Chiron looked at him silently. Then he closed his eyes tightly. The next moment, he jumped down. There was a high stone wall near the tree. Chiron hesitantly stepped forward. There were trees planted around the academy. The principal was sitting by the tree while his students were shouting that a commoner couldn't be here. The boy looked at them with fear. The old man called the child over with a smile and asked what he was so interested in. Chiron looked at him and said that he wanted to see magic. He was standing near the group saying that he had only read about it in books. He bowed and asked Alpheus to show him his abilities. The master raised his hand and said that he would show him a spell that created wind. The students looked at the teacher with admiring smiles. Chiron raised his hands when a gust of wind almost knocked him off his feet. All the children flew into the air. Chiron also found himself high in the sky. From afar, a bunch of students could be seen hanging in the air. Then they all began to fall down. Chiron waved his arms, shouting loudly. He saw green grass beneath him and realized that he was falling too. The boy closed his eyes and screamed loudly. When he opened his eyes, he realized that he was hanging in the air low above the ground and the others were laughing. The principal also smiled and said that this was magic. Chiron was sitting on one knee. Beads of sweat appeared on his face, and he asked what magic was. The master scratched his beard with a sly smile. The child began to cry, begging him to just tell him the truth. The students looked at Chiron with disapproval, discussing how rude he was to the principal. Maria's eyes shone brightly. Chiron looked at him silently. The old man smiled and said that magic operates beyond common sense and is a mental process that explores the truth of reality. The boy looked at the master and said that magic is irrational. Because of this, it is actually closer to the truth. All the young magicians opened their mouths in shock. The director raised his gray eyebrows and laughed loudly, asking if everything was written like that in the books. The child frowned and replied that everything was described in general terms and that in the end, many ideas were recognized as new truths. Stroking his long beard, the director thought. Chiron clenched his hands into fists and asked loudly what he needed to do to study magic. The old man thought with a smirk that this genius child was trying to get the right information despite the difficulties in order to study it on his own. Chiron's blonde hair fluttered in the wind and Alpheus realized that Chiron truly believed that he could do it. The director frowned, thinking that unfortunately Chiron was a commoner, and said that instead of explaining, he would rather show him. Shumin smiled and folded her hands when the old man asked her to enter the spirit zone. Chiron looked at the girl dumbfounded. Her eyes shone brightly, and she announced that she had entered. The director sitting by the tree asked her to guess how many coins he was holding in his hand, and the sorceress said the number 6. The boy's mouth dropped open in shock as Alpheus shouted that she had answered correctly. He showed the coins in his palm and replied that when a sorcerer focuses, his mind becomes so sensitive that he senses everything around him, and outstanding sorcerers are even able to count the number of leaves on a tree from afar. Shumin closed her eyes and said that there were now 3 coins. The mentor showed the corresponding number of coins and said that a sorcerer entering such a state sees the world using supernatural potential and can eventually manipulate reality. Chiron froze in horror thinking about this ability to immediately feel the integrity of the situation happening in front of you, and the director added that anyone can do it. He smiled and advised the new student to practice in a quiet place, and first you need to feel yourself, and then erase. The mentor looked down and said that if Chiron succeeded in doing this, another world would open up before him. Chiron opened his eyes wide and replied that if he did not feel himself, then there would be no way to erase himself. Much thought with a sly grin that this boy continued to surprise him and offered him to try right there. The child closed his eyes and tried to feel himself. He imagined his brain but decided that this was not what he should feel. Then he imagined the universe and thought that reality and the feelings he felt could not exceed the brain's representation. Chiron saw blue lines slowly erasing the things he felt. He did not begin to feel his existence. He stretched out his hand and thought that only the mind remained sensitive. The boy clenched his hand into a fist. He weakly opened his eyes and saw the students with the mentor. The director sitting by the tree asked how the child was feeling. He touched his beard with his hand and asked what exactly he felt. Chiron opened his eyes wide and replied that there were many sounds. He stood in front of the academy students who started laughing. Alpheus looked at Chiron and thought that he had failed. There were white clouds in the blue sky. The old man thought about the synesthesia of the aroma of sounds, the taste of light, and the feeling of scenery on the skin. He patted the child on the head and said that he would be able to hear even more if he continued to train. The students and the old man walked away back to the academy. Chiron was left standing by the tree, and the director thought that this child was very talented. He rubbed his beard thinking that if Chiron had been born an aristocrat and trained from an early age, he would have been able to achieve the same as these students. The master frowned his gray eyebrows and decided that there were many talented children in the world. Chiron climbed over the wall. He jumped down. He cried. As tears flowed down his cheeks, he said that it really worked. Chiron heard a loud sound. He thought that this was the spirit zone, as if he was torn into pieces and scattered all over the world. He saw the planet, the eclipse, and unexpectedly for himself decided that he was the world itself. The boy was moved to tears. He ran down the street trembling from this immensity. Wiping away tears with his sleeve, he remembered the feeling of leaving his body for a moment and becoming infinity. The boy spread his arms out to the sides, continuing to run. Suddenly, he collided with someone. Chiron flew to the side, falling to the ground. He raised himself up on his hands and apologized. He was surrounded by 4 adult guys. They irritably asked who he was. One of them grabbed the boy by the collar of his shirt. He demanded compensation from the boy for the blow, calling him stupid. Chiron apologized again, but the boy said that an apology was not enough. Then he assumed that the boy was from a gang of wolves. The little boy in tears asked if they had come to kill him. A voice came from behind them asking what was going on, and if something interesting had happened. It was Miss Amy. That's what the guy holding Chiron called her. The boy heard the question of what brought her here and the assumption that she was bored again. Chiron wanted to ask her for help but suddenly saw that she was an aristocrat. The girl came up and the boy looked at her closer, surprised that she was very young. The guy holding the boy reported that he wanted to kill someone and he was trying to teach him a lesson. Chiron responded to these accusations with protests, saying that he bumped into him by accident. The leader of the gang standing on the left angrily attacked him, shouting that he was talking nonsense, hoping that they would believe him. The boy ended up on the ground coughing, covering his face with his hands. He could hear voices demanding compensation, questions about his parents, demands to bring his mother here, mockery that she was hiding after giving birth to such a shameless boy. One of them looked at him carefully and called on the others to do the same, asking the boy about the change in the color of his eyes. Chiron looked at the offenders with sky blue eyes. They assumed that the kid was in a bad mood. Immediately, a kick flew to his head, accompanied by the phrase that the boy was an arrogant idiot. The guys began to kick him from all sides, asking why he did not repeat the trick with his eyes. From somewhere in the distance, shouts were heard demanding to be careful and not to break the boy's face. Then, in order to stop so as not to kill him, while the clatter of high heels was heard on the asphalt, the guys obeyed and left the child lying on the ground. Miss Amy knelt down in front of him and asked if he was okay. The boy replied that he had done nothing to his offenders. Tears were streaming from his eyes and he was sobbing softly. Amy informed the boys that it was definitely time to stop, asking if they really had nothing more interesting to do. They replied that they were going to sell the boy to a village in the south since he was a commoner, and therefore there was nothing to worry about. The little boy was terrified and began crying for his mom and dad. Amy put her hand to her chin and asked again if it was true that a slave should have no flaws. She, slightly embarrassed, suggested that they make sure of it. The boys, laughing loudly, asked again if she wanted to test him and without waiting for an answer, ordered him to undress. The boy seemed dumbfounded. The boys threatened to hit him again. Amy covered her face with her hand in horror, mentally calling her subordinates crazy because she only wanted to look at his face, not undress him. She wondered why the boy looked like that. She only wanted to mock him and let him go. Chiron was as if under hypnosis. His eyes began to glow blue. Amy, in horror, assumed that the boy was losing his mind. The offenders, not noticing anything special, laughed loudly. A fly flew to the mouth of one of them. It stopped its flight but did not fall because everything around it froze. Both the bird in the air and the rats who noticed her attack too late, including everything around, was flooded with blue light. Chiron asked what it was. He saw the huge hands of his offenders in front of him. Lightning cut through the sky and the boy saw a tree under which people in black cloaks had gathered. Chiron saw the image of an old man who said that he would show a spell that created wind. When Chiron suddenly realized that he was in his memories, a cloud of magical energy in the shape of a ball appeared in the old man's hands. The boy watched him fascinated. While in the real world, the attacker shook Chiron, trying to make him answer, called him a damn idiot, asked if he was deaf, making it clear that he was not joking with the boy. Chiron was as if enchanted. Miss Amy screamed, stopping them. But it was too late. The offenders were blown away from the boy by a shock wave. Powerful air currents swirled around him, and he himself was sitting on his knees. The boy looked at the sky with unseen eyes. Finally, he saw his offenders in it, and grinned. They were falling down. The boy looked ahead as debris fell around him. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. The green-haired boy who held him lay nearby, screaming in pain. Another had a broken leg. The third and fourth were begging for help. Chiron saw Miss Amy running towards him. She was asking who he was. The girl wanted to know where he studied magic as a commoner. The boy looked at her dumbfounded. Voices were heard in the distance. People were pointing to the place where the heroes were standing and shouting that a loud sound was heard in this messier. Miss Amy looked up, and in the blink of an eye she was on the roof of the house. The boy was shocked and perplexed by how quickly she moved there. And behind him, screams were heard. People were shouting that people had fallen here. Chiron turned around. He looked at his victims again and realized that people would definitely not believe what he was saying. The boy ran away as fast as he could. The defeated offenders cried for help. Chiron ran as fast as he could and called for his dad. He thought that this world was cold, and evening had fallen on the city. The sun was rising over the valley. The Karmas estate was illuminated by its light. In the silence of the house, an indignant voice was heard. Not understanding how a child could defeat someone, the head of the family heard it. He was reading the newspaper over a cup of morning coffee and decided to ask his daughter again why she returned early and assumed that she missed classes. Amy answered that she had already learned everything she could and was no longer interested. The father thought when she would grow up, no matter how great a genius she was, if she was so irresponsible, one day she could be caught off guard while Amy loudly stamped her feet up the stairs. But then she hesitated slightly. Chiron looked at his daughter and thought that she was quiet today, remembering that she usually answered him with a reproach that he had no work. Amy looked at him and tried to connect him and magic in her head. Questions arose in her head. It dawned on her. She decisively turned in his direction and asked if he knew anyone from the Magic Academy. Let him introduce her to him. Snow was falling quietly on the village houses. In the silence, a voice suddenly rang out, calling Chiron and asking where he was. Chiron's mother answered her father, who had just entered the house, that the boy had gone to the logging zone to get wood, to which the father asked in surprise, "Did his son really decide to cut trees in the snow?" Vincent, holding a closed book in his hands, said that he would go look for him. He walked through the snow and remembered that in the spring of this year when he first brought Chiron to the city, he almost lost him. The boy then ran to his father, saying that he was simply lost. Chiron was crying and his father did not believe him. Now he was wondering what had really happened to his son. In the forest, there was a huge tree chopped up by an axe. Chiron stood in front of it, holding the tool in his hands. He cleared his throat. Memories of that day in the city came to mind. The boy remembered the magic he had summoned. It had thrown the offenders away from him, but he could no longer use it. The magic had been summoned unconsciously. The boy wondered what intermediate process had been missed due to insight because he had no knowledge of magic. Suddenly, his eyes glowed blue again. He realized that he was still able to enter the spirit zone. This realization made the boy grin. The whole world was painted in blue light. Chiron felt everything when he was in this state. The surface, the shape, the smell. He could simultaneously feel every part of the tree standing in front of him. Light sparkled in the tree trunk. It surprised him. He swung the axe. The boy could not explain what he felt. Chiron struck the tree trunk. There was a crash. The tree fell. The boy stood amazed. He was able to cut the tree with one blow, and concluded out loud that it was magic. His father, hiding behind the tree, was amazed. He saw everything that happened and thought that the boy made a thunder strike. Cut the tree with one blow by hitting the weakest point of the trunk. This technique is called so because when the tree falls, it makes a sound reminiscent of a clap of thunder. Vincent came out from behind his shelter. The boy was actively sawing the tree. He thought that this was the first successful case after 100 attempts at cutting trees as well as using magic that day. His father began to cry. He clutched the book he had carried from home tighter in his hands. The boy decided that he did not need coincidences. He needed extensive knowledge. He promised himself to practice endlessly day after day for the chance that would one day come. 3 years later, Chiron was sitting in the forest on a stump of a felled tree. Then he stood up. He took an axe from the log. He walked up to the tree and said to himself that now he did not need to see with his eyes. He swung it hard. The axe did its job and the boy finished the sentence that he felt with his eyes. There was a crash and the tree fell. Chiron, pleased with himself, concluded that once he meditated, he could go home. He guessed that about 5 hours had already passed. Chiron stood holding the axe in his hands and the world around him was once again painted in blue light. The boy felt as if he had become one with nature. He felt the leaves swaying in the wind, the worms moving in the earth, the sounds of the trees absorbing moisture through their roots. He admitted to himself that even 5 hours would not be enough to enjoy it all to the fullest. An image of the teacher appeared in his head, telling him that if the boy could, another world would open up to him, and he silently agreed that another world was the most appropriate name for what he had seen. Chiron was leaving the forest with a bundle of firewood on his back in the rays of the setting autumn sun, mentally repeating to himself that it was time to go back. Suddenly, he saw white horses. It was not typical for their place. He put the bundle of firewood next to a luxurious, in his opinion, carriage and thought that perhaps they had guests. The boy opened the door and said that he was home. Suddenly, he stopped, calling his father. Vincent was surprised that his son had already returned, and told him to come up to him and greet the guests. His father introduced him to the butler of the Ogent family, who said that he was pleased to meet him, and called himself Temirin. Chiron bowed and introduced himself, saying that they met for the first time. The butler replied that he came to see the boy. Chiron was confusedly spinning his thoughts in his head. Why would a man working for the nobles need him? Especially since Ogent is a second-class aristocratic family in the kingdom. The butler touched his shoulder and asked to look at the guy first. He took Chiron by the chin and asked if he could read. The boy replied that he had been reading a little since childhood. The butler turned the boy with his back to himself, and he asked if the man could explain what he was doing. Temirin said that the boy had a good reputation. The son of a woodcutter who could read respected his father. The boy tried to stop him, but he made him an offer to work at the Ogent estate. Chiron asked again. The butler explained that they needed to transport books from a huge home library in total, which contained 10,000 books, including important works, the leakage of which could not be allowed. The work would last 2 years. He looked closely at the boy and continued to say that other people would carry out the transportation, and only he and Chiron would sort the books. The boy was inspired to work in the library, and especially in the Ogent estate. One can certainly find useful information for magicians. The butler continued. The only people who knew about this were the boy's family. So if even one book were to go missing or even word of the library's contents were to spread, you and your family would be dead. At these words, the parents looked at each other in resignation. Chiron finally understood why they looked worried. The butler continued that since it was a risk to the family, he was offering enough money, an amount they would never earn by hunting, which meant that raising their son well was worth it. At these words, Vincent jumped up and shouted in irritation that he had not come to him for the money. He stammered that he simply wanted there to be able to achieve his dream. He stood, leaning both hands on the table. The butler laughed at his words. He asked what they were thinking. Did they really hope that their son would build a career? He told them to wake up and asked if this was not done for the money. Then why did they ask to take their son? Vincent, gesturing vigorously with his hand, answered that it was because the butler said that Chiron would be able to read books. To which he replied that the boy could, but his job was to supervise the process, not to read. Temirin continued, asking if his parents wanted their son's dream to come true. Why were they lying to him? Vincent's face darkened. A memory appeared before his eyes. One day, when he returned home, he asked if Chiron was reading a book. His mother answered that Olina had taught him a few words for fun. But when he was 6, he began to read on his own. His father looked at his son and noticed his expressive facial features, thick hair. But what was more important was that he was smart. A suspicion that his adopted son could be a nobleman crept into his head. He covered his eyes with his hand, thinking that if the boy had been raised by aristocrats, he would have had the opportunity to go to school. But then he interrupted himself with a question about what he was thinking. After all, Chiron was his son, so it would be right for the son of a woodcutter to learn to work in the mountains. He imagined the boy sawing a tree. When Chiron started doing this, his father was scared. Vincent covered his face with his hands. After all, this boy was raised by a woodcutter. He remembered how he fell to his knees and asked the butler again if he needed a commoner who could read and asked him to take his son, saying that he had been reading since childhood and was generally intelligent. And he begged for only one thing, that his son be allowed to read books. A tear rolled down his eyes. Vincent came back to reality, and harshly replied that he did not need any money, and if he had known what would happen, he would not have begged. And then he screamed at the top of his lungs for the butler to get out of his house right now. Temurin turned away and headed for the exit. Vincent asked how he dared to mock the fact that his family had little money. The old man grinned and realized that there was nothing he could do about it. The butler looked back in surprise when Chiron said that he agreed to this. Chiron stepped forward. His father called out to him with displeasure. Turning to him, the servant said that he was not trying to simply scare him, but warned that even the slightest rumor would make his head roll. Smiling, the boy asked permission to work and promised never to divulge anything. Slightly knitting his eyebrows, Temurin said that he would pick him up in a week, adding that he would have the opportunity to refuse. The old man left the house and said at last that he could not leave the mansion until all the work was done. Raising his hand, the man asked why his son agreed to this and explained that these scoundrels simply needed a man who would die for them. The hunter shuddered tensely when the magician called out to him. The magician closed his eyes and thanked him for such a valuable gift. The head of the family began to cry. Vincent hugged his son, asked him not to worry about anything, and promised to protect him. Frowning, the man urged him to return safe and sound, and said that he would make sure that they did not lay a finger on their family. Olina wiped her tears with a handkerchief. The hunter wondered if he had really managed to raise a good man out of his son. Chiron closed his eyes and cried. A week later, the head of the family signed the papers, and a man from the Ogent family declared that everything was ready. The servant immediately snatched the documents from his hands. Men in formal suits escorted Chiron to the carriage and announced that it was time for them to go. The carriage door slammed. The stranger sat down opposite the boy. He closed his eyes and frowned. Vincent hugged his wife and they began to cry. The boy extended his hand to them. The wheels of the carriage were clattering on the road. The magician reached for his father. The magician grabbed his hand and realized that he had to stop doubting. The carriage was driving along a forest road. Chiron thought that he had a great chance. But everything was not so simple here. Chiron closed his eyes and wondered if he would be able to safely live for 2 years among people with great influence. Light particles appeared above the forest. A map of the kingdom appeared. The house of the Ogent family was in the city of Craze. It was a family of warriors who had been raising professional swordsmen since ancient times. The man smiled and said that the previous head was a state fencer of the 3rd rank and the current head is an honored knight of the 4th rank and controls the military forces of the city. The butler looked out the window and said that this is a local landmark, the Great Walkway. A long road led to the mansion. The heroes got out of the carriage. The butler asked the guests to be careful because this family is full of monsters. His friend asked him to watch his words so that he would not be hanged. The man said that they need to go down this path. The boy looked around and realized that he was beginning to realize that all this was happening for real. There were many yellow trees in the garden. A stone horse towered over the fountain. The horse was depicted on the coat of arms of a family of second-class aristocrats. The heroes approached the chancery building where the guest was to stay. Tiran rose from the table. The boy bowed and promised to do his best. The butler asked him to follow him, and said that he would explain the necessary tasks to him. The wooden doors opened. The magician's mouth opened in surprise when he found himself in the great Ogent library. There were many books on the shelves. The servant explained that the books from here would be moved to a new library, so they needed to be sorted according to a list that would be given out every week. Dust was flying around the bookshelves. The old man informed him that the work lasted from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, and warned that the employee was not allowed to go outside or enter the estate without special permission. Temurin handed him the papers and added that the junior butler would tell him the rest of the rules. Frowning, the wizard decided that it was worth risking his life and asked when he could start. The servant replied that the work would begin tomorrow. The bright sun illuminated the library. Chiron took the papers in his hands and walked forward. He placed the documents on the table. Chiron sat at the table and thought that one person should be in charge of arranging the books because the structuring should be consistent. The history of fencing books shown, and when classifying it one might wonder whether it should be categorized as professional fencing or comprehensive history. The boy frowned and realized that he had found out another fact while working with the structuring systems. An infinity sign appeared above the documents, and all knowledge was interconnected. The boy pursed his lips tensely and decided that the basis for their connection was history. The roots of the tree went deep down, and knowledge was accumulated on a line called history. So history was the backbone of knowledge. Frowning, the mage thought that studying thoroughly and using it to reinforce other fields would speed up his learning and decided to read these books to achieve his dream. The mage looked up and saw the deputy chief enter the library. Chiron placed the book on the table and realized that he could not let anyone see him reading it because it was not officially allowed. Frowning, Temurin noticed that sorting was easy for him and asked if he was working overtime. Chiron stood up from the table and confirmed it. The man turned away and said that he still had much to do and asked him not to kill himself before the time because the responsibility for this lay only with him. The butler looked back and gave him a stern look. Suddenly, the servant approached the employee. The scoundrel leaned towards him. The boy wondered if he had been caught reading after hours. The boy's brows furrowed tensely, brushing off his uniform. The old man explained that not only the staff but also family members came to this library and asked him to pay close attention to the uniforms so as not to belittle the dignity of the Ojin family. Temurin took a lock of his hair and ordered his subordinate to do something with his hair. The mage trembled and wished him good night, thinking that he would have to be very careful for the next 2 years. The stars were shining in the sky and the mage realized that he needed to concentrate to avoid getting into trouble. At night, Chiron sat at a table in the library holding a book in front of him. Chiron realized how difficult it was. Frowning, the boy thought about how difficult it was to learn even the history of one kingdom, and decided that he needed to understand every event perfectly in order to use the information at any time. His eyes began to close. The boy fell asleep right at the table. Someone took the book out from under his hands. The butler looked at it and concluded that his subordinate read this book for a full moon cycle. Smiling, the servant asked if he really thought he would succeed through studying and said that he would forbid him from entering the room outside of working hours if he caught him reading practical books. The old man headed for the exit and realized that he was just a foolish dreamer. 3 months had already passed. Someone asked if these were the books he needed. The magician smiled, confirmed it, and said that these bundles could already be taken. The butler took the book and said that he would lend it to the young master. The magician took the reader's sheet and explained that they had not returned the book they had taken last time. The servant said that they always claimed that they would bring it themselves. The man scratched his head and said that the aristocrats did not care whether the books were lost or not, so it was only their responsibility. Chiron narrowed his eyes and suggested that there were hardly any really important works in this library. The butler warned that no one should know that he had said something like that. The servant waved his hand and left. Chiron realized that this did not mean that he was safe and decided that an aristocrat can live in peace only when commoners are loyal to him and peasants risk their lives for something that nobles will not even remember. In the memory, Temurin threatened to cut off his head. It is quite natural for servants to become cold and heartless to prevent the slightest mistake. Smiling, the boy said that it was not so important and realized that it was better for him to just live quietly. Suddenly, someone burst into the library, cursing the old man. The boy opened his mouth in surprise and wondered if something had happened. The young man trembled and asked what terrible thing would happen if he rested a little today. The magician remembered that this was the Lord's youngest son. Rian ran to the table. Someone shouted that they would catch him and make him run 100 more laps around the yard. The nobleman placed his hand on the wizard's shoulder and asked him not to tell anyone that he was there. After that, the nobleman hid under the cabinet. The man opened his mouth wide and shouted that he knew that the young master was hiding there. The old man approached the table and asked if a man with blue hair and the size of a peanut had come here. Chiron wondered how he saw him if he thought that big guy was a peanut. Smiling, Chiron concluded that he was talking about the younger master and asked who he was. Gritting his teeth, the fencing instructor introduced himself and asked him to answer the question if he did not want to get beaten. The boy narrowed his eyes and said that he understood everything. The guy pointed at the cabinet and said that the young master was hiding under it. Rian called him crazy. When the teacher grabbed him by the shirt, the young man shouted that this was some kind of misunderstanding. The mentor threw him aside. The magician closed his eyes when the sound of a blow was heard. The man grabbed the child by the leg and said that he would have to train his spirit again. The aristocrat angrily clenched his teeth and whispered that the librarian would pay for this. Smiling awkwardly, the wizard thought that he had no other choice because the teacher had great authority, and remembered that according to rumors, the teacher sent the young master to the mountains. Sitting at the table, Chiron thought about how he read one book in 20 days, and after fully understanding it, he mastered 82 more in just 4 months. Holding the book in his hands, Chiron realized that it was only difficult at the beginning and that the rest of the works no longer contained fundamentally new information, and decided to lay the foundation by reading 200 books so that the remaining 600 would be assimilated even more easily. Frowning, the boy thought about the fact that he had some doubts, and wondered if it was right to study history now. The people were holding books. If a scientist studies a theory, then a magician implements it in real life. So, it is almost the same. But not all scientists can become magicians. The boy looked up and realized that not everyone can enter the spirit zone, a state of heightened sensitivity of the mind. The magician closed the book and concluded that he must add a huge amount of information to it, which will become the basis of knowledge. Chiron smiled and suggested that he could become a real magician in this case. Rian opened the doors and called out to him. The young man gritted his teeth and said that he had gone through hell while waiting for this day to finally come. Chiron pursed his lips tightly and found that this was quite insistent. The boy asked if he really came here for this. The young master approached him and confirmed it. Imagining how he had to climb the cliff, the nobleman asked if the servant knew how much hardship he had endured and said that he only held on because of the thought of revenge. The boy frowned in fear and realized that things were worse than he thought. The nobleman asked if the librarian was going to answer him. Frowning, Rian reminded him of how he trusted him and was indignant that he still turned him in like a true coward. The magician explained that he did not turn him in, but simply told the truth. The young man grabbed him by the vest and said that he should have said right away that he would not fulfill his request. The wizard looked up and thought about how powerful people prefer to use logic that is convenient for them. Chiron frowned sternly and asked what he needed to do. The young gentleman's eyes widened in surprise and wondered why the seemingly unremarkable butler was so unperturbed. The aristocrat smirked and asked if the servant also treated him with disdain. The clouds covered the moon. The nobleman decided to explain more precisely who he was and asked the librarian to follow him. Chiron's mouth dropped open in surprise. Looking at the young master, the boy realized that they had come to the training grounds and wondered if he was planning on beating him until he vented his anger. The boy frowned and thought that he could not miss the chance that his parents had given him. A wooden sword flew into the air. The wizard caught it in midair. Raising the weapon in front of him, Rian declared that this was a duel and explained that he would have to take the blows of his sword as punishment for disrespecting the man who was destined to become the greatest swordsman. The wizard's mouth dropped open and asked if this was fair. The boy reminded him that a servant of the Ojin household had the duty to protect them. The young master's eyes flashed and said that the butler had turned him over to the teacher because he was afraid of punishment. Chiron trembled and noticed that his gaze had changed. The aristocrat declared that he would not tolerate such an attitude from an ordinary library employee. The tip of the sword flashed. The nobleman took into account the difference in skill and allowed his opponent to attack him 3 times. Chiron frowned tensely, realizing that he would be sent home if he broke even one bone, and wondered what he should do. The boy's eyes widened and he remembered that he had 3 tries. The boy swung his sword with all his might. Rian immediately blocked his blow. The magician gritted his teeth and realized that his opponent had incredible strength. The wizard gripped the hilt of the sword tighter. The boy blocked his next blow. Their swords clashed. The young master smirked and asked if the servant had never held a weapon in his hands. Chiron gritted his teeth and realized that he had one last try. His eyes lit up. A bright aura enveloped his opponent. Chiron raised his sword above his head. The nobleman asked what kind of situation this was. The wooden swords crossed. The nobleman smiled slightly and declared that it was his turn. Suddenly, his sword shattered into small pieces. Rian looked at them in shock. Only the hilt remained in his hands. The boy's mouth dropped open in amazement, and he realized that his gamble had paid off, and that he had managed to sense the essence of things and calculate the speed of his opponent to deliver the perfect blow. The young man stared at the broken sword. The boy thought about the fact that he had been practicing the thunder strike for over 3 years. The wizard's brows were drawn together tensely when the young master called out to him. The nobleman frowned and asked where the butler had learned fencing. The wizard spread his arms and replied that it was a thunder strike, not fencing. The nobleman asked what it was. Placing his hand on his chest, Chiron explained that he often worked in the mountains with his father, and added that he learned this technique to compensate for his lack of physical abilities. Chiron said that lumberjacks called it a thunder strike, and Rian raised his eyebrows in surprise and wondered what he was talking about. Gritting his teeth, the young man remembered that he had trained to wield a sword for 15 years and wondered if such a technique could be learned while chopping wood. A strong blow cut off the tip of the sword. The child held a training weapon in his hand. Someone called his strike amazing. The defeated brother sat on the floor in front of him. The mentor was surprised that his student had already mastered the secret technique of Ojent, and said that he had nothing more to teach him. Placing his hands on his son's shoulders, the man declared that Rai had inherited his genius and proposed to throw a grand banquet to immortalize this day. The young master frowned in displeasure, and wondered why he could not catch up with his brother. The image of Rai appeared behind the boy. The nobleman opened his mouth in anger, and shouted that he could not accept this. The boy raised his eyebrows and asked what was going on. The nobleman ordered him to shut up. Beads of sweat were running down the mage's cheeks. Rian picked up a real sword. The weapon slid into its sheath. The youth threw it to his opponent. Lowering his hands, the young master explained that there was no winner in this duel because their weapons were destroyed, and added that the servant must learn to properly handle a sword strike. The nobleman pointed at him and said that in a month they would duel with real swords in the same place. The wizard bowed his head. In his trembling hands lay the sheath. Chiron realized that he could die in this fight. Putting his hand to his chest, Chiron asked the master to think again, and said that he had never learned fencing. Rian narrowed his eyes and replied that he was giving him some time for that very reason, and suggested that he would be able to figure it out since he was so talented. The boy stared at him in fear, and the young man urged him not to even think about running away and declared that he would fight until the end. The mansion was illuminated by the bright sun. Sitting at the table, the boy realized what had happened and remembered that the Ojent family's specialty was the inheritance of black and blue hair. The mage introduced the members of the family. The head's eldest son was a professional swordsman. His eldest daughter chose music over fencing and became a pianist. And the second son was called a genius. The butler smirked and declared that Rian had no talent. The young man was different from his talented brothers, and everyone who worked in the manor knew this story. Clutching his head, the wizard realized that he should have just let him beat him up, and thought about how he had hurt the pride of a man who had already been compared to his relatives all his life. Squinting, Chiron remembered that he thought all nobles were outstanding and decided that he should just do his job to stay alive. Sitting on a chair, Chiron wondered what would happen to his parents if he died. The boy took books from the shelf and realized that he did not have much time. There were fencing textbooks on the table. The boy was confident in his stamina and magical abilities, so he only needed to learn how to defend himself. The mage began to read the book and wished to do everything in his power. Clouds floated across the sky. Someone screamed. Enraged, Rian ran forward. Standing on the training ground, the teacher announced that 100 laps had been completed. Smiling, the man said that he managed to beat his own record and asked why his student was training so hard. The young man knelt down and asked if this could be called training. The old man asked what he was talking about. The young gentleman opened his mouth wide and shouted that he was still standing and asked if he had anything harder. The teacher scratched his beard and asked what had happened to him. The aristocrat frowned menacingly and replied that everything was fine. The teacher narrowed his eyes suspiciously and assumed that he had learned something new and remembered that he had already managed to awaken his scheme. Standing in the huge arena, the teacher agreed to give him a difficult task and warned that he would not be held responsible for his death. A man appeared against the background of the magic circle. A scheme is both an imaginary body and its schematic image, which is an analog of the state of the spirit. People stood with their backs to each other. Everyone has an idea of their body, but the scheme is an extremely accurate embodiment of it. Energy shone around the man. Masters of the scheme fully understand their body and can even participate in the movement of its cells. Holding the book in his hands, Chiron wondered if this was the complete opposite of the spirit zone, and asked himself if he should try it. Chiron closed his eyes and felt himself first. His body was enveloped in blue energy. For the spirit zone, a person must erase himself, and for the scheme, he must dig deeper into the essence of his existence. The boy lowered his head and realized that he could complete the first stage of the scheme if he could pull back the curtain at this moment. Looking at his hands, the boy decided that putting effort into a process that was the complete opposite of the spirit zone was ineffective, and remembered that the girl they met 3 years ago also used the scheme. The blade of the sword sparkled. The magician chose to use the spirit zone to learn the basics of fencing. The wizard went out into the yard and wanted to start with cutting strikes in 8 directions. Chiron raised the sword above his head. The blade of the sword hit a wooden stake. Rian continued to beat the log. The teacher asked him to stop so that his muscles would not tear. The sword hit the wooden counter again. The young man asked why his hands weren't falling off. The man watched him in shock. With tears in his eyes, the young master asked why he couldn't use the diagram. The old man stopped his sword with his bare hand. The nobleman froze in place. The mentor suggested that they stop there. The weapon fell to the ground. The teacher applied ice to the student's shoulder. The teacher looked at him and asked what he was thinking about. The nobleman replied that he was thinking about how he would die from the pain in his hands. The man turned away and admitted that he never wrote in his reports that he had talent. Rian gritted his teeth and said that was why he was straining himself. Looking ahead, the old man asked if his student ever thought about what he was good at. The youth said that he knew for sure what he was not good at. The mentor said that was why he was not a genius. The young master pouted and asked him not to remind him of this again. The teacher smiled and explained that geniuses know what they are good at, so they work hard and are guaranteed to achieve what they want. Chiron was reading books in the garden. The teacher explained that geniuses are afraid of trying hard for something they cannot achieve. The aristocrat's eyes widened in surprise. The man said that the fiery will to achieve results, and what they are not very good at can be called the mortal enemy of geniuses. The nobleman smiled and said that this was the best consolation in recent times. Rian clenched his fists and realized that he must work hard until he gains the talent he did not have to begin with. The young man grinned and decided that he could win. Chiron wiped the sweat from his chin with his hand. Standing with the sword in his hands, the boy thought about fencing being a set of dynamic blows, the purpose of which is to eliminate the opponent, and a set of psychological combat techniques. The moonlight reflected on the blade. It may seem that the enemy has the ability to attack in an infinite number of directions, but in fact, there are only 8. The boy imagined an imaginary enemy in front of him, and realized that he had been learning to cut in 8 directions for a whole month. The enemy struck. The magician also learned to block the opponent's movements. The magician raised his sword and blocked the attack. Chiron began to fight the imaginary enemy. Their swords hit each other. A blue haze appeared in the air. Chiron opened his eyes wide. Waves of light energy swirled around him. The boy threw the weapon on the ground and concluded that this is how swordsmen chose this path. The boy looked at the sky and realized that the world of fencing is actually endless like the magical world. Putting the sword in its sheath, the magician asked his parents for forgiveness and explained that he could not return. The lights came on in the arena. The wizard thought that he had no regrets and was glad that he was lucky enough to see this amazing world. Rian stood in the center of the arena. Chiron stood opposite him. The young man took his sword out of its sheath and offered to start the fight. Chiron held the blade out in front of him. The young gentleman noticed that his opponent radiated incredible confidence. The nobleman remembered their previous fight and decided that he really had no idea about fencing that time. The nobleman gritted his teeth and was indignant that his opponent was so calm, even though it was the first time he held a real sword in his hands. Rian rushed forward and realized that he should win if this servant was as talented as Ray. The young man ran forward and announced the start of the duel. The boy's eyes widened and he realized that his skill level was much higher. A trace of the sword's swing appeared in the air. The boy looked at the blade approaching him. He dodged the blow because he could feel its path. The young master's mouth fell open in shock and he wondered if his opponent was watching the weapon. The magician looked forward confidently. The nobleman wondered if the butler was not afraid of him. The wizard frowned and realized that he could not resist the fear of death. Chiron imagined being wounded in the chest and thought that death, the source of this fear, was in the future, and the future was an illusion that did not yet exist. The man stood on the edge of a cliff. He took a step forward and Chiron realized that anyone could jump off the cliff if they did not imagine what would happen next. The nobleman raised his eyebrows and decided that his opponent was not blindly ready to die, but rather had absorbed all his emotions. The boy took a step into the abyss. Rian raised his weapon in front of him and decided that he was not afraid of something like death either. The young man swung his sword and rushed forward. The boy raised his weapon and realized that his opponent was preparing to attack him from the right. He managed to block this attack. The young gentleman's eyes flashed with fire. The aristocrat grabbed the hilt and remembered that there was a wall that could not be overcome with just cheap tricks. The nobleman began to deliver successive blows. The magician gritted his teeth and thought that they were too heavy and fast. The wizard imagined his opponent as energy and realized that the speed of his blows was beginning to exceed the frequency at which he could sense the direction of the sword with synesthesia. Rian frowned menacingly and struck again. A cut appeared on Chiron's chest. His eyes emitted bright lightning. The blade of the sword flashed. Chiron realized that he was starting to lose. The young man raised the sword above his head and screamed loudly. The boy ducked to the ground to dodge this attack. He had to jump back. The boy narrowed his eyes suspiciously and noticed that something was wrong here. The magician parried another blow and wondered how this could be. Grinning, the young master mentally wondered if his opponent had only just realized this and thought that this was the skill of Ojent fencing, which was created for training with two-handed swords. The wizard put his hand on the wound. The nobleman decided that his opponent could not withstand his heavy blows because he was putting the effort of his entire skeleton into them. With his mouth wide open, the nobleman wanted to crush him with his strength and urged him to move forward. Rian delivered a powerful slash. Chiron frowned and realized that if the opponent had raised his sword up after cutting his chest, he could have simply cut him, and that would have been the end of it. The young man swung his sword. Chiron realized that his understanding of fencing was even worse than he thought and decided that despite using certain techniques, he clearly lacked insight. The boy sternly knitted his eyebrows and wanted to reduce his combat capabilities, which he could calculate. An energy arrow rushed down. The swords hit each other with a ringing sound. The guy swung his sword and decided to change his plan. Rushing into the attack, the magician delivered a sharp blow. The young lord's eyes widened as he wondered why his opponent had suddenly decided to attack and was surprised that he hadn't tired yet. The wizard gritted his teeth and began to throw punches. As he held back his attacks, the nobleman realized that they were all basic moves and wondered why they were so hard to block. The nobleman frowned and parried another blow. His eyes flashed and Chiron noticed that his stamina had dropped significantly, and he realized that he now needed to maintain a rhythm to maintain his own. Rian's pupils narrowed and he thought that this couldn't be happening. In the memory, Bischoff placed his hand on Ray's shoulder and praised him for his excellent work. Then the servants surrounded his fallen son. The child turned around and looked at his brother. A malicious grin appeared on his face. The youth opened his mouth in rage and called out to the butler not to dare mock him. The young lord swung his sword and shouted that he would become the best swordsman in the world. Chiron held his blade out in front of him and blocked his attack. The nobleman frowned menacingly and wondered what his opponent was thinking. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. Holding the weapon in front of him, the boy realized that he could no longer see the path of the sword because too many random possibilities had appeared. The nobleman rushed forward and screamed loudly. The edge of his blade approached the magician. His blue eyes showed and there was a sound of impact. The sword flew into the air and sank into the ground. The magician opened his mouth wide and began to breathe heavily. Rian narrowed his eyes and tried to catch his breath as well. The young man looked down and wondered if this was really possible. The heroes stared at each other in silence. A few moments ago, the young gentleman made a sharp dash towards his opponent. At the last second, Chiron intercepted the hilt of the sword. Chiron swung it sharply, and he managed to parry the opponent's blow. The boy frowned tensely, trying to catch his breath. The nobleman could not understand who he really was. With his eyes wide open, the boy was surprised that he managed to win and asked himself what would happen next. The nobleman looked down. The magician realized that he did not know what would happen next since he had hurt his pride again. The magician continued to hold the weapon in front of him. Rian admitted his defeat. The young man scratched the back of his head and was upset about another loss. The young master looked up and said that he would not dare to say anything against it, even if his opponent decided to kill him. Chiron looked at him in amazement. Chiron smiled and asked if this was really a joke. The nobleman opened his mouth in surprise and asked what it meant. The boy asked if he really thought he would be left alive if he killed the master. The noble smiled and reminded him that they were putting their lives on the line. The boy stated that he had no intention of risking his life. He was simply trying to survive. Raising his hand, the mage said that their fight had been absurd from the start, and asked why the blame lay with him if he simply did not want to train. Rian shouted that he should have shown some respect. The mage opened his mouth in anger, and suggested that he show some respect to his butt. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. Chiron explained that a man worthy of respect would never put his butler in such a position, and asked if a man worthy of recognition should not proudly face his teacher. The young master imagined himself pointing at the servant, and challenging him to a fight. But from Chiron's side, it looked more like a threat to his life. The boy fell to the ground and said that he really thought he was going to die. The nobleman looked down at him and wondered if people didn't give each other some kind of warm compliment after a duel. The boy closed his eyes and asked what that was all about. The nobleman wondered where the cold-blooded warrior he had fought had gone. Imagining the grinning Ray, Rian noticed that the genius wasn't laughing at him like his brother did and realized that the butler had gathered all his strength to fight him. The boy asked his name. The magician looked away and said his name. Standing in front of him, the young gentleman introduced himself. The nobleman extended his hand to his opponent. The magician didn't understand why he suddenly decided to give his full name. The nobleman leaned towards him and offered to become friends. People came out of the library with piles of books. Standing in the building, Timurin reported that his subordinate had sorted 7 out of 10,000 books. The man looked back and praised him. Chiron smiled and expressed his gratitude. It had been a year since he was invited to this job. Looking after the butler, Chiron thought about how his productivity had increased because the number of books he had to sort had decreased. Putting the book on the shelf, the boy remembered that he only had 200 books left to read and decided that he could fill the foundation of knowledge by reading 3 books a day. Remembering his fight with Rian, the mage realized that he had been able to recognize the essence behind fear and decided that the duration of his spirit zone had increased thanks to this. Closing his eyes, the wizard realized that he actually thought that he was going to die and thought that he would definitely achieve his goal if he did not give up. The boy picked up the book and asked if his family actually read them all. Chiron decided that nothing could compare to making a good friend. Chiron climbed the ladder and said that the head of the family and the second young master often visited the library. The nobleman suggested that being smart must be great. The nobleman threw the book away and said that he was not interested. Over the past year, the boy noticed that this man was quite gentle and sweet despite his enormous height. The boy picked up the discarded book and asked his comrade not to do that again, otherwise he would be killed. Smiling, the swordsman asked how a book could be more important than a human life and promised to protect him even if he burned the library to the ground. Putting his hand to his head, the mage said that he would be safe if his friend did not touch anything and asked why he was not training yet. Rian folded his hands behind his head and explained that he told the teacher that he wanted to study in the library for a while. The wizard asked if he shouldn't read in that case. The boy waved his arms and legs and said that it was too boring. The heroes stood with their backs to each other. The young master was like a fire that could not be stopped and would light up again and again as long as there was a chance. 10 minutes later, the boys sat down at the table and picked up books. Frowning in displeasure, the nobleman remembered that his comrade wanted to become a magician and asked if it was really necessary to read so many books to do so. Chiron confirmed this and explained that he had not had the opportunity to study before coming here. Chiron flipped through the pages of the book and said that he knew almost everything because he had read 600 books on history. The nobleman's eyes widened in surprise and wondered how he could read so quickly. The boy silently read the book. Rian noticed that he looked quite mature for his age. The boy buried his nose in the book and called it quite interesting. The boy put the book on the table when the young master asked who would win if a swordsman and a mage fought. A bird flew over the snowy forest and Mount Artisna towered nearby where a carnivorous tree grew. The nobleman declared it too boring. The wizard opened his mouth wide and shouted that he was interested. The nobleman was indignant that there were not even pictures. Chiron snatched the book from him and asked who the author thought would win in a duel. Ray entered the library and declared that the swordsman would obviously win. Chiron bowed and greeted him. Rian asked how he knew that. The boy took the book from the table. The boy frowned and hoped that the young master had not heard their conversation. The nobleman looked away tensely. His brother silently picked up the book and thought that a servant who spoke so freely with the Lord's child would not get off with just a spanking. The nobleman smirked and asked why his brother was so sure of that, suggesting that he was on the swordsman's side because he was one. Rai gave him a stern look and explained that the answer was obvious just by looking at the situation of swordsmen and mages on the continent. Rian narrowed his eyes slightly and asked if that was such a big deal, stating that they did not choose their opponents on the battlefield based on their military rank. The boy turned away and asked the butler what he thought about that. Chiron's brows furrowed tensely. Chiron froze in place and thought that he could not figure out what he wanted to do to the many thoughts in his head. The nobleman narrowed his eyes suspiciously. The boy realized that he only needed to give a suitable answer. The boy frowned and suggested that it would be difficult for the swordsman to defeat the mage once he entered the spirit state. The wizard looked at the master and decided that the swordsman could use his powers before the mage cast his spell. The nobleman refuted his words. Ray smirked and declared that the mage would lose. Chiron looked down tensely. Rian angrily clenched his teeth and thought that it had always been like this. The boy sat in the shadow of his brother. Since childhood, the Lord's son liked to trample what was important to people he didn't like. Looking to the side, the young master noticed that he liked this story and assumed that the butler had heard of the armor of the 5 gods. The young man frowned and remembered that this was an artifact that destroys the spirit zone. The guy's eyes widened in fear when he heard that they were talking about anti-magic. The innate ability of mages is the spirit zone to fight a mage in this state, akin to a duel with sharks in the depths of the sea. However, something can evaporate the water and deprive the sharks of their senses. The man from the portal confidently stepped forward. He went outside using anti-magic. If the state of the spirit can't reach this armor, then magic can't either. Then what kind of mage can fight someone who uses such a powerful artifact? But this is just a theory because originally anti-magic was an expensive technique created from the mana flowing in the heart of the dragon. Also, since it has fluctuating qualities, its effectiveness rarely increases no matter how much money is invested in it. Even Yakra, a master of the equation of fluctuations, was only able to reveal 65% of the total potential of the armor of the 5 gods, and because of this, its price. Smiling, Rai said, "Of course, it is unaffordable because the cost of each element is equal to the annual budget of an entire kingdom." When suddenly, Rian slammed his fist on the table, asking, "What the hell is this? Because then, how can a swordsman become stronger?" Lowering his head lower, Rai replied that the problem is that those who created anti-magic are mages. Frowning, Rian asked why they needed it, to which his brother immediately replied, "Since there is a huge demand for it, it is an ideal way to make money." Looking away, he added that wizards literally line up to be used, so there is no need to buy such a priceless artifact, and magi are a pathetic class of people who sell the weakness of their people for profit. Gritting his teeth, Rian shouted that his words were too cruel. Smiling, Cheyenne replied that this was the essence of magic. Ray's face changed, asking what he said, to which the guy added that anti-magic was created by wizards. Losing himself in his memories, Chiron added, and was used to limit magical activity in places where it was prohibited. It was also successfully used as protective equipment in magic schools. And although it could be used against wizards, this did not diminish its value as a fruit of intellect willingly given for the good of the whole world. So based on this fact alone, it was difficult to confirm that a swordsman was more powerful than a mage. Ray's eyebrows drew together in anger. Rian coughed, covering his mouth with his hand. His brother turned around, shouting that ideas and reality were very different, and yet the fact remained that a mage could not win in a fight with a swordsman. Watching him go, the boys breathed a sigh of relief. Chiron smiled and said that he thought he was going to die. Rian threw his arm over his friend's shoulder, shouting that he was incomparable, because it was the first time he saw his brother with such a face, and if Chiron's tongue was a blade, he could become the best swordsman in the world. Closing his eyes, he added, like a breath of fresh air. As Rai said, ideas and reality may differ, But an exploratory mind ruthlessly experiments even on its own weaknesses. And can one say that this intelligence exists for the sake of world peace? 6 months later, the man was writing something in a report, while the butler stood in front of him. The man reached for a mug of tea. Frowning, Timon said that they finished faster than expected. Looking at him, the butler said that it was wonderful that the move had been made 6 months early, but he was even more pleased that the books that had been neglected for 20 years were perfectly sorted, and then asked if the man was sorry to let such a useful person go, because if they had used some excuse to extend the contract. Taking the mug away from his mouth, Temurin replied that of all people, he was the only one who talked nonsense, so he asked him to pay more attention to his work. Thoughtfully, he took a sip of tea. Chiron turned the page. Closing the book, the guy thought that closing it was easy, but closing a book after reading 100 of its pages was quite another. Putting his hand to his chest, he thought that this was just a dream. Rian burst into the room, shouting if Chiron had really finished working and was not going home yet. The guy's eyes widened in surprise, asking if he had really finished everything. Smiling, Chiron replied that there was nothing more to read. Rian grabbed the boy by the shoulders, shouting that he was amazing, asking if he really did it. Looking into his friend's eyes, Chiron said before he left, smiling, he asked if they could go to his place and play together. Putting his hand to his chin, Rian replied in confusion that Chiron had hidden their friendship for so long. He felt rather sad about it, and that was why it was unexpected to hear him say such things. Scratching his cheek with worry, the guy thought that he regretted it, too. Lost in his memories, he remembered that they mostly met in the library and almost never spent time together. Smiling, Rian shouted that his whole family had left today. After a while, Chiron looked up in surprise. Approaching the doors, he thought that this place was a little scary, after which he asked if they could really pass through the main gate like this, when suddenly his friend turned around, answering that the guy should not worry because his relatives would return late in the evening. Putting his hands in his pockets, he said that only the servants were here. Looking around, Chiron wondered if this huge door really led to a room and if there was one room the size of his entire house. Opening his mouth, he thought that the guy really was from a rich family, to which Rian pointed forward, saying that this was his room. Chiron's eyes widened in shock. Looking inside, he thought that Rian's abode was the smallest room at the end of the hallway. Looking around, Chiron thought that it looked like a small room that you go to after training, and the guy lived there. There was a book on the table. A drop of sweat was dripping from Rian's face. Chiron was listening to music with a smile. The guy clenched his teeth in anger. Throwing the cards up, he shouted that he was not playing anymore because he lost again. Clenching his hand into a fist, he shouted with crazy eyes that Chiron was cheating using his spirit zone or something like that. Putting his hand on the table, Chiron replied that his friend had a habit of pushing the card forward when he took an ace. Besides, it was obvious how long it took him to decide whether it was a pair or not, which made Rian very surprised, asking how he determined that. Raising his index finger up, Chiron replied, "Sometimes observation gives the best result if you don't focus on something specific. Because if you watch the enemy as a whole rather than just individual actions, you can predict their plans." Rian put his hand to his head, asking not to focus on something specific and just see the big picture. Putting his elbows on the table, he asked if it would help awaken his scheme, to which Chiron smiled, answering perhaps, because in the end, it helped him enter the spirit zone. Covering his mouth with his hand, Rian said that he felt like he understood, but at the same time, no. Taking the book in his hands, the guy asked if he could borrow it because he was tired of reading only history books. So, for the first time in a long time, he saw a novel. A tired Rian was sleeping on the table. Looking at the clock, Chiron asked if the guy's family would really return late at night. Turning his head, he was suddenly surprised by the sound of the piano, thinking that in this mansion, only one person could play the piano. Sitting in the slightly open door was the fake pianist and Rian's older sister. The girl was softly playing a musical instrument. Reina turned her head back, asking the guy how he was. Opening his mouth in fear, Chiron realized that she had noticed him. Looking inside, he answered confusedly, "Very cool." Wondering what to do, smiling, the girl said that it was the first time she saw him, then asked if he was new, to which Chiron nodded, answering that he had been sorting in the library for a year. Reina put her finger to her lips, answering that she had heard that not everyone could do it, which meant that he was quite smart, then asked if he had ever played the piano. Lowering his head, Chiron thought that he should not let his guard down. After all, she was a professional who used the scheme when she performed, and Rian definitely said that the worst person in the manor was his sister, then answered, "No, never." Knocking on the seat, Reina asked if he would sit down since she could teach him. Pursing his lips, the boy wondered if he really needed to sit there. Smiling, the girl said that it was okay since no one would scold him since she had allowed it. Swallowing, Chiron thought that she was persistent, and he was in no position to refuse. Sitting down on the chair, the boy wondered when he would get another chance to sit at the piano, after which Reina pointed to the keys and then to the symbols on the sheet music. Putting her hand on it, she asked him to try pressing 3 keys at the same time. Blushing with embarrassment, Chiron thought that it sounded great. Placing his hands on his knees, the boy asked if he could try playing when Ray suddenly turned around, saying, "Okay." Looking down, Chiron said that it might be unpleasant to the ear, after which, the girl smiled, wondering if he knew any more chords besides the ones she showed him. Chiron carefully placed his hands on the keys. He began to press them one by one, covering her face with her hands. Ray thought that everything was wrong. Blushing with embarrassment, she thought that he was confidently pressing the keys and wondered if she could stop him. Smiling in confusion, the girl thought that he was wrong about everything. Opening her mouth in surprise, she thought that at the same time, the melody sounded similar. Ray looked at him carefully, thinking that he was completely imitating her performance. Chiron's pupil lit up brightly. The piano was suddenly enveloped in a bright aura. The guy began to melodically press the glowing keys. Reina carefully watched his fingers. Browsing, she wondered if he was gradually starting to play correctly. Chiron raised his hand up, and a bright beam flew high. Chiron continued to confidently play the musical instrument. Opening her mouth in surprise, the girl thought that she couldn't call it a game, but he had a strange insight that he understood the essence. She was confused, wondering why such a child was a butler, when suddenly Chiron turned around, asking for forgiveness. A loud scream suddenly rang out from behind them, asking the witch to stop making noise. Rian rushed into the room, shouting that since Reina had returned home, he should go to bed. Noticing Chiron next to his sister, she asked what he was doing here. The girl was surprised, asking if they really knew each other, to which Chiron turned around confused, saying no. Opening his mouth in excitement, the guy thought that his friendship with Rian might be exposed. Frowning, Rian said that the guy was his friend. Falling to his knees, Chiron shouted, asking what the master was saying, to which Rian began to laugh, answering that the boy should not worry. And although this evil witch has a rotten soul, she does not care about such things. Chiron became worried, thinking, "Is it so important?" Reina put her hand on his shoulder, saying it is okay because if Rian says that they are friends then everything is fine, and although sometimes he is a little pathetic, he takes responsibility for his words. Smiling, she asked what Chiron was thinking when he played just now because she really wondered when suddenly Rian frowned, asking if it was really Chiron. The wall of common sense that Chiron built for 16 years was broken. After which she wondered if the lady does not care about her brother's friendship with a peasant. Pointing at the girl, the guy asked why Rian lied because his older sister is a kind and beautiful lady. Frowning, Rian asked him not to be so naive since she was a witch. And who knew when that woman would try to swallow him whole. Smiling, Reina apologized for her little brother being a bit __, but she was glad he had a friend like Chiron. Grinning, Rian asked why she didn't just take him since he was so cute and make him part of the family while he was here. Looking at him, the girl asked if they were so close that he would even mind giving him his older sister. Laughing, the guy replied that she wasn't the prey here, but Chiron. Reina pushed him to the floor, asking if he really thought it was okay to act like a jerk since everything was so cute. Standing up, Rian asked what she was doing at home since she had just left, after which, the girl dusted her hands, saying that Rai would be taking the certification test, and she had come to pick him up tomorrow, and they were leaving. And a little later, her grandfather would come to see his friend. Her brother said crazy. With his eyes wide, he lowered his head and said upset that it was really time. The certification license is a standard and order for swordsmen and mages which is recognized not only in the kingdom but also throughout the continent, and about 1,000 people take the test every year but about 30 pass. There is also a non-certification license. If someone graduated from an institute approved by the kingdom such as the Alphea's Magic Academy, they can become a non-certification 10th rank mage and can increase their rank by gaining achievement points through associations or guilds. But people obviously gather where the money and fame are. And even though there is a non-certification license, there is still a constant demand for the certification test. It is surprising that Rai will take it at such a young age, 18 years old, when suddenly Rian exhaled, saying that geniuses are different from others and their family fully supports them. Reina patted her brother on the head, saying that she will go and prepare everything for dinner. The seafood came from the royal palace, so she needs to cook it herself. Smiling, she told Chiron that it was nice to meet him, and then asked if they will meet again. Nodding, Chiron answered yes and then wondered if there would be a chance to see her again. Remembering their piano playing, he thought that he would leave the mansion tomorrow. The guy suddenly turned to Rian. With wide eyes, he asked if his sister has a boyfriend. A look of great surprise appeared on Rian's face. He suddenly smiled widely when suddenly Chiron lowered his head, saying that he was just curious and asked to forget what he said. Quickly running forward, Rian ran towards his sister with loud shouts, running after him. Chiron thought that he had lost control of his tongue because he was sad. Leaning on the railing, Rian shouted that Chiron asked if the girl had a boyfriend. The maids stood in formation towards Rain. The girls turned around sharply, raising their heads. Running up from behind, Chiron covered the guy's mouth with his hand. Laughing, the girl asked the maids not to pay attention because the children were just fooling around. Taking a few steps forward, she said that they had finished cutting up the fish, so it was time to cook it. Frowning, the head butler asked Hannes if the young master really had guests today, to which the subordinate replied that nothing was planned. They looked at the balcony, noticing the guys. Lost in thought, the butler said that the name Chiron sounded familiar, and he seemed to remember. Turning his head, he asked to tell Temirin to come to his office immediately. Loud screams were heard in the forest. Holding the weapon in his hand, Rian was breathing heavily. The mentor scratched his beard, thinking that the guy took up the matter again. And last time, he went out rather quickly. Pursing his lips, he was sure that everything would change as soon as Ray got to the royal palace. And the problem was in the scheme. The guy turned his gaze, hearing a scream from the side. A man in a hat was running towards him, shouting that Lady Reina was asking him to return to the mansion right now, to which Rian rolled his eyes, answering that if it was about his brother, he was not interested. Running up, the butler shouted that she said that the temporary butler Chiron was in danger, on the verge of death, after which water flew out of the guy's mouth. Jumping up, he asked why since Chiron was supposed to be returning home today, and the butler shouted that Louis had sent a report to the head of the family, and the lady said that it was because of his relationship with Rian. Throwing on his cloak, the boy shouted that he needed to see his father since the butler, whose name was Chiron, was his friend, and it seemed that his father had somehow found out. With his brows furrowed, he added that he was sure his father would forgive Chiron if he put in a good word, so he would continue training later. When he suddenly heard a clear answer, no. He dropped his hands in surprise. The teacher had a large sword in his hand. There was no one around the mansion. In front of the sofa, Chiron was kneeling. His hands were clenched into fists from excitement. Gritting his teeth, the head of the family said that the boy would be executed. People in the crowd began to whisper, asking how this happened. The maids were talking, that a commoner dared to deal with a nobleman, and he should have known about the line that should not be crossed. Temirin turned his head to the side. Bischoff continued to look at the paper in his hands. Reina put her hand to her chest, shouting that she had something to say. The father quickly began to flip through the report provided by the head biller. Looking at the servants, he added that many of them testified to how carelessly this child treated Rian. Looking at Chiron, the head said that since the boy was reading the contract, he should have no objections when suddenly Chiron said that he had a question. Raising his head, he asked if he was a friend of the young master, then what would happen to him. The servants clenched their teeth in excitement, asking if the boy did not understand what was happening now because the boy should be begging for mercy. The girl frowned, wondering if even in such a situation he was worried about her younger brother, to which Bischoff frowned, asking if Chiron dared to ask him such a thing. With wide eyes he added that he was a fool like all commoners, and then asked what he thought might happen to the noble hanging around with him. Chiron exhaled, smiling. he said that it was true that Rian was his friend. Without turning away, he added that they had been friends for a year, so they would continue to be friends. While the butlers frowned with his brows drawn together, the chief said that the guy seemed to be taking the Ojent family lightly. Picking up the report, he suddenly asked the header to quickly deal with the guy and not let others know about what happened. Standing in front of her father, Ray shouted for him to listen to her, to which the man shouted that he had already made his decision. And once he made his choice, there was no turning back. The butler asked the chief with his brows furrowed if this wasn't too much, to which the other man added that he saw no reason for everyone to die because of one person. Fear appeared on the man's face. Frowning, the old man continued that this house was their life and in order to protect it, they needed to get rid of even the slightest conflict that was flaring up. Looking after Chiron, he said that now someone might think that this was wrong, but later they would be grateful for such a choice. Sharply throwing open the doors, Rian shouted loudly that he would not allow this to happen. Reina happily turned towards her brother. Chiron looked coldly at her friend. Frowning, Rian shouted, asking who was going to kill his friend without permission. Frowning, Bischoff replied that it was him. The boy spread his arms and asked why, since he had not committed a mortal sin, but had simply become his friend. When the leader suddenly replied that one did not need to sin to deserve death, and that he could not even imagine how difficult the noble's circumstances were, and as long as their family could cope with this difficult situation, the boy could enjoy the privileges of being the son of an aristocrat. With his mouth wide open, Rian shouted that these privileges did not matter if he had to get rid of his friends for them. Bischoff's eyes flashed with anger, as he replied that being friends with a noble meant being on an equal footing. Turning to Chiron, he asked the boy if he really thought that this peasant saw him as a comrade, since there were many people in this world who wanted to sit on the necks of aristocrats. Rian's eyes widened in anger as he shouted that Chiron would never do such a thing. Frowning, the father asked if he should really believe the boy and then asked him to prove that he and Chiron were truly true friends. Rian furrowed his brows in horror, thinking that they had hit the nail on the head. Looking at his father's smile, he thought that if he said he couldn't, then it was all over. The boy looked ahead menacingly, wondering if it was possible to prove someone's feelings. Looking down, he thought that he couldn't just say something randomly, and if he were Chiron, he would easily defeat him. His eyes widened, and he turned his gaze to the side. The boy looked at Chiron's gaze, thinking that he had a gaze that analyzed everything, and he had the same one when they fought. Chiron's eyes lit up brightly. Rian thought about his words that sometimes observation gives the best result if you don't focus on something specific. Remembering Chiron holding out a card, he thought that then he would be able to understand his true intentions. Gritting his teeth, the boy thought about the person right in front of him. He thought of his father as a second-class nobleman and knight, and this was not just a quarrel between father and son. He firmly gripped the hilt of his sword with a trembling hand, thinking that this was a sword fight. 30 minutes ago, Rian jumped in front of the teacher, shouting that his friend could die, when suddenly, the man clenched his fist, asking if he was talking about that boy who worked in the library, but he was a commoner. Opening his mouth in surprise, the boy indignantly shouted that he did not know that the teacher was like that. Closing his eyes, he loudly shouted that according to the teacher, if you can talk to a person by crossing swords, then he can be a friend. Coming closer to the boy, the mentor asked if he knew what the most important thing for aristocrats was and then added that they should get rid of anything that undermines the reputation of the family. Looking at the trembling student, he added, asking if he had ever thought about the pressure his friend was under when he realized that he was no more important than anatomy. And after thoughtlessly befriending him, he should not even try to argue to resolve the issue. Clenching his fist tightly, Rian shouted that he couldn't just stand there and do nothing since he was the one who asked him to be friends first. Raising his fist, he added that he didn't want to be a coward. Frowning, the teacher thought that the boy was determined, passionate, honest, innocent. But one couldn't become a great swordsman by relying only on these qualities. So, he had high hopes and would root for him. Pulling out his sword, the man asked his student to take it. Handing the weapon into Rian's hands, the mentor said that he would let him go if the boy took it with him. But if he was not ready for this, then he should not dare to take a step from here. Confidently knitting his eyebrows, Rian replied that he would never forget this. Turning his gaze to the side, the teacher told the boy to remember that abandoning a friend is like abandoning a part of yourself. The boy thought that this was a sword fight with his life on the line, and then began to laugh loudly, shouting as expected of a father. He almost defeated his son. Frowning, he shouted that he would prove that he and Chiron were friends because he believed in it. Looking into the man's eyes, he added that the fact that he was his friend was proof, to which Bischoff gritted his teeth, shouting that this was nonsense because it was not about wealth. Looking back at the Billers, he shouted that even now the reputation of many nobles was sinking to the bottom, and he was ready to completely abandon his son in order to prevent the fall of the family. Excitedly placing her hand on her chest, Reina shouted loudly. Rian put his legs together, saying if this was necessary to protect his friend. Bowing, he added that he would gladly leave. Jumping up from his seat, Bischoff ordered him to raise his sword, and since he truly considered this boy a friend, he should risk his life. The boy confidently pulled the weapon out of its protective case. Frowning with excitement, the leader asked if the boy really dared to raise a sword against his father. Holding the weapon straight in front of him, Rian replied that it was not aimed at his father, but simply showing his confidence. Bischoff put his hand to his chest, shouting that his son did not get along even with other nobles, because he was far from their level, and now he kept someone worse near him in order to assert himself. Confidently looking forward, Rian said that this time his father was wrong. Swinging his sword, he added that Chiron was a friend who was better than him, so he wanted to help him so that he would shine brighter. Pointing his finger at Chiron, the leader shouted, asking if the boy really turned his son's head and convinced him that an aristocrat and a peasant could be friends. Indignant, Chiron replied that he did nothing of the sort, when suddenly Rian covered him with himself, asking him to stay put because he would protect him. Chiron suddenly called out to his friend from behind. Looking him in the eyes, the guy said that Rian was not responsible for all of this, so he would take responsibility. He remembered when the young master wanted to be his friend and assumed that one day he would have to choose between friendship and his life. Smiling, he said that even if it meant that he died here, he would never regret being friends with him. Tears appeared in Rian's eyes. Sharply turning back, he shouted that this was exactly what he wanted to say. Looking into the eyes of his shocked father, the guy shouted that even if he was expelled, he and Chiron would still remain friends. Looking at the smiling Reina, the guy thought that even if they were not mature, they were still people with their own feelings and emotions because a true friend is someone who will never turn away from him. Turning to the crying butlers, he thought that everyone has such a person or everyone dreams of such a person. Louis clenched his teeth in anger. Everyone suddenly turned around when they heard a loud laugh, and Reina suddenly put her hand to her chest, recognizing her grandfather. The old man laughed, shouting that he never thought he would see such a show at his age, and being young really is wonderful. Seeing the old man, Ray happily exclaimed that everything will be fine now that her grandfather has come. And her father turned to her father and said that he saw that he had already arrived, adding that Ray said that it would take longer. Chiron opened his mouth in shock and said to himself that this man was General Thormia, a third-class swordsman and Rian's grandfather. Clumph, the previous head of the family, crossed his legs and said that it was as noisy as ever, adding that youth was the best time. Bischoff sat down next to him and said that in this situation, no, their family's image had sunk to the bottom. To which he, with a wide smile on his face, said that there was no need to jump to conclusions because he had observed this situation from behind the scenes and it was obvious that many people here had something to say, so why not hear other people's opinions on what was happening. Then Reina, the eldest daughter who was the first witness, put her hand to her chest and said that although she had only met Chiron yesterday, she could see that he was an intelligent and talented child and that he had fulfilled all the requirements of the contract and was supposed to leave the mansion today. Spreading her hand to the side, the girl added that given these circumstances, it was quite difficult to say that Chiron had any evil intentions towards Rian. In the end, she did not think that his actions had tarnished the family's reputation. The old man raised his hand to his chin and thoughtfully said that he understood her position, in which case he was interested in knowing what his second grandson thought. Ray, the second son and also the second witness, proudly raised his head and gritting his teeth, said that he did not like this boy. Hearing this, his father smiled contentedly and said to himself that he knew he could rely on him when suddenly his son said that he did not care. Surprise appeared in Bischoff's eyes from what he heard, and he asked what he meant. He did not like him, but he did not care. Then Rai folded his arms over his chest and answered that he did not like him, but he did not care who Rian was friends with because he just wanted this all to end and for them to go to the royal palace. His sister Reina opened her mouth in surprise from what she heard, saying to herself that he had such a character. When suddenly the old man laughed and said that this is exactly why there is no place more interesting than home. And in conclusion, he wanted to hear the opinion of the one who knew Chiron the longest, the deputy butler. The third witness, the deputy butler, Temirin, stood to the side with his head down. He suddenly looked up at his comrade, who was pointing his finger to the side. Temirin saw his master's displeased look and said to himself that he was sure that Klumpf knew that they were not the ones allowed to voice their opinions because they were people who carried out the will of their masters. After a short pause, the old man opened his mouth, calling the name of Chiron. Folding his hands, he quickly said that the boy had done the job assigned to him and done it perfectly, and he finished it 6 months earlier. His comrade clenched his teeth at what he heard and asked in a whisper what he was doing now. And Klumpf folded his arms over his chest and asked if he knew that they were friends. Temirin put his hand to his chest and obediently answered that he knew about his frequent presence with the young master, but not that they were friends. However, in his opinion, if Chiron were a simple child, he did not think that he would be able to sort those 10,000 books. After hearing this, Rian happily turned to his excited friend. His sister, putting her hand to her chin, said to herself that the atmosphere had smoothed out, and the only one who wanted to punish Chiron was his father. Bischoff looked at Chiron with a displeased frown. Suddenly, Klumpf stood up from his seat with a stern look and said that he could not approve of this. Hearing this, his granddaughter screamed in shock, asking what he was saying, and his son smiled contentedly. After which, the old man said that he understood that they were true friends, but one way or another, it was time to end. He looked closely at the boys, adding that if this continued, rumors would spread and become a weakness that political opponents could use against them because everyone in his family held an important position in the kingdom. Klumpf looked at his son and grandson, then said that even Rai had a certification test coming up, then asked what he could do if he had such a large family. The maid stood aside worriedly, and the old man continued to say that Chiron was a smart child, so he hoped that he would understand. Reina turned her worried gaze to her brother. Rian knitted his brows in anger after hearing this. Seeing this, Klumpf smiled in confusion and said to himself that he knew that he was determined, and then asked himself how he could not realize what he was saying, since he also understood how huge the weight of countless lives was at stake. With these thoughts, he looked at Chiron and asked him what he thought, adding that he was grateful to him for teaching his naive grandson about true friendship, and then asked if he could end it now. Chiron lowered his head in disappointment, and firmly replied that he could not. Shock appeared in the eyes of everyone present after hearing this. Rian turned sharply to look at his friend. He wanted to say something to him, but Chiron put his hand to his chest and explained that if he was a hindrance, then Rian would never see him again. But that did not mean that he could not continue to consider him his friend. With bitterness in his eyes, he looked at Klumpf and said that he and Rian were friends. And if they took this into account, he would follow any of their orders. Rian's hand, which held the sword, was shaking. Tears flowed from his eyes because he understood that Chiron would not die. This was already a relief. But he thought so only in the depths of his soul. But he already knew that abandoning a friend was the same as abandoning himself. With these thoughts, he continued to look at his fearless friend. When suddenly he raised his sword above his head and said to himself that in any case this cannot be agreed upon, after which he shouted with all his might that he hereby declares. His grandfather and sister, knitting their eyebrows, looked at him. Suddenly Reina, realizing everything, screamed loudly, begging him to stop because she knew what he wanted but he shouldn't do it. At the same moment the blade of the sword pierced the floor. Rian knelt down. Looking at the floor, he screamed loudly that he, the third son of the Ojink family, would become the sword of Chiron from now on. His father shook from what he heard, and he screamed with all his might and rage that he was a fool. The scream rang out throughout the Ojin family's territory, over which clouds hung. The history of the Knight's Oath dates back to the time of the formation of the Kingdom of Thormia. During the years of chaos, both small and large countries fought for territory. Ataulf was the first, the strongest of all, to unite and create Thormia. But the new kingdom had to rebel against powerful neighboring countries. So instead of exiling the kings who were defeated, they were allowed to govern their own territories. And during this, the Knight's Oath was born. The knight knelt before the king. As a reward for the promise to become the only sword of the Lord, they received the status of nobles. This is how nobility was born. So breaking an oath means becoming worse than a stray dog. Joyful Rian turned to his father and shouted, asking how he should be because he can't take her back. He saw the shocked open mouths and said to himself that it seemed like he had caused a stir today. Chiron immediately rushed to his friend asking what he was doing when suddenly the old man with glowing eyes smiled and asked if this child was really so competent, if he really said that he would become his sword. Was Chiron really brilliant, or did he shine so brightly in his eyes because he was not? Chiron helped Rian to his feet. Suddenly a smile appeared on the guy's face. Hitting his chest with his hand, he shouted that the sword does not judge. It only protects. The Ogent family subordinates looked at their youngest son with excitement. But to everyone's surprise, Clump put his hand to his face and laughed loudly, shouting that they, immature ones, should at least do this to reach the heights. Standing up, he continued shouting that his grandson was good at talking. But with such disgusting swordsmanship, he felt sorry for his friend having a sword like him. To which Rian tried to object. Then the old man put his hand on Chiron's shoulder and said that it was time to calm down. After all, everything was over. Even if Rian was not the best sword yet, he would never point his blade at him, so he should take care of his grandson. Hearing this, Chiron nodded silently. Opening his eyes, he warmly thanked him for his approval. Immediately after that, Clump extended his hand towards the head butler and ordered him to take the carriage that Chiron was supposed to ride home in and bring his parents here, adding that since the two of them had become sworn friends, he couldn't let them go so easily. The head butler was speechless and said to himself that it seemed real, adding that he would never understand what nobles were thinking. Clouds were floating across the bright sky. At this time, Rian raised his hands and laughing loudly shouted that he was very happy. He jumped on the bed, adding that it was amazing, and Chiron sat down next to him and said that he took a knight's oath and he shouldn't do such a thing for him. Then Rian jumped up and said that he did not do it because he was his friend. Smiling widely, he explained that he was different from his older brother. He had the power to attract people, he just decided to bet his life on such a person. Hearing this, Chiron blushed and said in confusion that he felt so much pressure. Turning away in embarrassment, the boy added that if he was going to protect him, then he needed to work even harder. Suddenly, Reina opened the door to the room and screamed, asking if her brother really lost to Chiron in a duel. But when she saw Rian lying on the floor, she asked what was wrong with him, to which he replied that she should get out, causing Chiron to exclaim, asking what he was saying since his sister helped them so much, so she should definitely come in. When Rian asked what his father and grandfather were doing, the girls sat on the bed and replied that everything was bad there since he blurted out the knight's oath. They were thinking about a new plan of action. In any case, their father wanted to enroll them in the Kaizen Swordsmanship Academy. After saying this, she looked at her brother with a worried expression and said that she remembered that he had said that Chiron had a talent for swordsmanship before. Hearing this, Chiron raised his eyebrows in confusion and asked if that was true, to which she exclaimed, "Of course," adding that he was now like a family member. So, she told everyone about his talent to see if there was a chance that they would want to invest. And apparently, they wanted to make it a success for the sake of Rian's future. Hearing this, Rian raised his head and shouted in displeasure, asking if they were sending him to school without his consent, just when he could finally play whatever he wanted with Chiron. Suddenly, his sister kicked him with her heel and shouted that he was very stupid. Then asked what he was trying to do after causing such a commotion. The guy frowned angrily and shouted that in any case, Chiron will not go to the fencing school because he is a future mage and has already opened the spirit zone. Hearing this, Ray turned around in shock at Chiron and screamed, asking if it was really the spirit zone, which made him blush. After a short pause, the girl looked at her brother and asked if he really gave a knight's oath to Chiron. How could a swordsman be weaker than a wizard? Then Rian, with tears in his eyes, loudly shouted for her to get out of here. A few minutes later, Reina imagined how the guy's swords clashed and said that it means he used the synesthesia that he feels thanks to the spirit zone to predict her brother's move and win. Raising her hand to her chin, she added that Chiron came up with this well, and apparently it is possible because the power of his spirit zone is quite great. Chiron folded his arms and asked in confusion if that was the case, to which Reina pointed her index finger and exclaimed that he was amazing, adding that she heard at school that the higher the level of concentration, the stronger his spirit zone becomes. And it was even more amazing that he achieved such a level of concentration with the sword in his hands. Chiron, hearing this, lowered his head in embarrassment, and the twins simultaneously said to themselves that if he was so shy, he would never be able to start a relationship. After a short pause, Ray looked at her brother and said that she would then talk to her grandfather about Chiron's career path. And of course, on the condition that he attends a fencing school, which made the boy stand up and ask in surprise what would happen to his teacher. Then the girl raised her eyebrows in surprise and replied that Teacher Kate already knew about it, so he decided to end the contract tomorrow. He said that he would give a farewell speech in the morning. Hearing this, Rian looked at his sword with excitement. In his mind, he imagined his teacher walking away into the distance. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and the servant said that the members of the young Master Chiron's family were already here and were waiting in the reception hall. And the head of the family said that if Chiron wanted, he could meet them first. Ray turned to Chiron with a smile on her face and asked, "Well?" The guy smiled widely and shouted that he was already on his way. He ran at full speed descending the stairs, and the butlers around him told him to be careful because the steps were very steep. The guy, without stopping, said that they could talk to him like before because he had not become a nobleman, to which they were very surprised and exclaimed that they were not allowed to talk like that because they would be executed. On the massive door was written Reception Hall. Chiron swung the door inward. His parents immediately jumped up from the sofa. Without thinking twice, Chiron rushed towards them. The boy ran and jumped into his parents' arms. Looking at them, he said to himself that they had lost a lot of weight. They probably hadn't slept at night, worrying that he would return to them dead. His mother, with tears in her eyes, told him not to worry because they lived peacefully, ate well, and his father, holding out his hand, asked why they were called. If he had already finished work, he should have returned home. When suddenly his expression changed, and he asked if they were really keeping him here, not allowing him to return back. To which Chiron, raising his hand, answered that it was not so. He was simply given a good opportunity. Olina wiped away a tear and asked what kind of good opportunity. Then Chiron told him everything with a wide smile. His parents listened to their son with their mouths open in surprise, when suddenly shock appeared in his father's eyes. After the story, he grinned and asked if he was really saying that while he was working in the library, he became friends with the young gentleman, and he gave him a knight's oath and he received permission to remain friends with him. To which Chiron, turning his gaze to his father, exclaimed that it was exactly so. When suddenly Vincent grabbed his son by the shoulders and loudly shouted that it could not be that such a smart child like him would say such nonsense, after which he asked if someone was really treating him badly. But he shouted back that it was all true. Hearing this, the man began to hug Chiron, sadly shouting that everyone said that those who got into the house of aristocrats cannot return home in their right mind. When suddenly the doors to the reception hall opened and those present were informed that the head of the family had arrived. Bischoff was the first to enter the hall, and Rian and the eldest daughter Reina entered after him. Seeing them, Chiron's parents were horrified. They immediately bowed loudly, shouting that they were Chiron's parents, and then asked why such great people had honored them with their attention, to which Reina asked in surprise if they hadn't been told anything yet. Vincent opened his mouth wide and exclaimed, asking if his words, his delirium, were true. Less than 10 minutes later, they were already sitting at the royal table, and the man was saying to himself that this couldn't be. Chiron's father was confusedly asking himself what the hell was going on, and his wife sitting next to him was excitedly whispering to him that there were too many forks here. After a while they were sitting next to Chiron on the sofa and servants were bringing them tea. In front of them were all the members of the Ojin family. The cup of tea was shaking in Vincent's hands from excitement, who was saying to himself that he didn't know what a knight's oath was. But it couldn't be that they would show such goodwill to the woodcutter's family, so he definitely needed to find out everything. He excitedly twitched his leg and suddenly said that he was grateful that they were so generous to his son, but still a little worried because the young master of the noble family of Ogent swore an oath to Chiron, and he could not believe it. Bischoff closed his eyes and said displeasedly that if he were honest it was a little unpleasant, but still for the Ogent, a family that honors the policy of Millerism, the knight's oath is indisputable, and if they were so disrespectful just because of the difference in status, then Rian's honor would be tarnished. Chiron's parents listened to the head of the family with ridiculous smiles on their faces. Opening his eyes, Bischoff added that from now on they will also use a respectful form of communication, so they should not feel uncomfortable. This family will support, and will not turn away from Chiron. To which his father, smiling maliciously, said that he had not heard the right thoughts from him for a long time. At this time, Chiron raised his eyebrows in surprise and said to himself that making such a difficult decision for the sake of his family, and treating people with honor and respect was in keeping with Ogent's status. And although he had no choice but to take the peasant under his wing, he was not bullying anyone. Reina looked at him with a wink. On the other hand, Rian gave him a thumbs up with a wide smile on his face. Bischoff folded his hands and said that to get to the point, surprisingly, their son was using Spirit Zone, and Spirit Zone was not something that could be achieved through hard work, but a talent that one was destined to be born with. Frowning, he added that as far as he knew, his goal was to become a mage. So if he wanted to get an unofficial magic review as soon as possible, then Alphea's Magic Academy, which was one of the 5 most prestigious schools in the kingdom, would be suitable for him. The bright sun is shown on the huge Magic Academy. Bischoff put his hand to his chin and added that he was not saying that Chiron should go to the academy to become a mage, but not doing so with a number of privileges was stupid. So he did not advise him to refuse, and he should go to this place to meet the standards of the Ojin house. When suddenly the old man turned to him and said that he did not say the most important thing to them. Hearing this, Bischoff remembered what he wanted to say, causing Chiron's father to frown in excitement. And as soon as the man said that if their son graduated from the Magic Academy, he would become a wizard, Vincent jumped to his feet and shouted loudly, asking if his son would really become a wizard. Calming down, he looked at Chiron and said to himself that this seemed like a dream. But suddenly Bischoff said that there was one problem. It was his affiliation, causing Vincent to frown in shock. The head of the Ojin family leaned towards his father and said that magic schools are elite. They do not enroll anyone except the children of aristocrats. Therefore, but before he could finish speaking, Clump said for him, "There is only one option." With glowing eyes, the old man looked at Chiron's father and firmly said that they would like to adopt Chiron. Hearing this, beads of cold sweat appeared on Vincent's face, and Clump explained that this was the only way found during the family meeting. Then, he put a document on the table and added that he has a young cousin who does not have children yet. If Chiron's name is added to the family registry, the problem will be solved. They have no intention of stealing his child. Everything will be only on paper, and thus Chiron will become a noble. There was shock in the eyes of Chiron's father, and he said to himself that his son will become a noble. Who else on earth would be given a chance to change their origin? But if so, it would be as if they would allow their child to be stolen. Turning excitedly to his son, he asked him to tell his father what to do. But suddenly he saw the calmness on Chiron's face, and wondered if he had made a decision in advance. Chiron suddenly put his hand on his father's hand. Then he squeezed it tightly. Chiron's eyes showed excitement, and he exclaimed, "Never, because he is his father's son, and cannot become someone's adopted son." Hearing this, Vincent smiled in confusion, and Ray, stretching out her hand, explained that it would only be in the document. Of course, they would treat his parents as real. He would also be able to fulfill his dream and nothing would change. Her grandfather raised his eyebrows in surprise and added that he would also become a nobleman, and such a good opportunity is not given to everyone. Chiron, frowning, objected that if he had to replace his father, he would rather live as a peasant. Hearing this, Clump furrowed his brow and shouted that a commoner would not be accepted into the Magic Academy. To which the man calmly replied that he would not go to the academy then. The old man continued to shout that he would not become a mage. Then his son and granddaughter looked at him worriedly. Chiron shouted back that it was okay if he did not become a mage. His mother and friend looked at him confusedly, furrowing their brows. Suddenly, Clump stood up and shouted, asking why the boy was so unwavering because the world was not simple. Fury appeared in his eyes and he shouted loudly that there were things that had to be given up in order to achieve success, after which he asked if his dream was really so insignificant that he could not do it. Chiron stared at his interlocutor, answering that maybe so. Tears appeared in his father's eyes from what he heard. Chiron continued to hold his parents' hands, explaining that it didn't matter how beautiful his dreams were, because that was what he received from his parents. And if his parents were his roots, then his dreams were the fruits nourished by them. He remembered when he first learned to read. The boy also remembered how he got the chance to work in their house and said that all of this was possible only because his parents were his roots. The one chance he got was nothing compared to the countless opportunities given to him by his family. A warm smile appeared on the boy's face, and Chiron added that saying that he should give up his roots was the same as telling him to dry up and die. He was grateful to them for the offer, but his only parents were these two people. Everyone present could not take their shocked eyes off Chiron. Clump calmed down and asked himself if this was guilt, maybe morality, knowing what he was trying to say. But before he could finish speaking, Vincent suddenly bowed his head and screamed, begging to adopt his son. Hearing this, Chiron looked at his father in surprise, and the old man, exhaling heavily, explained that he understood what he meant. But it was also important to consider Chiron's wishes. But unexpectedly for everyone, the man raised his head and said that Chiron was not his biological son. His wife turned to him and screamed, asking what he was saying, to which he, bowing his head, screamed in response that they could not have children. Without raising his head, the man explained that Chiron was a child that they got by chance, and he was sure that the guy was from a noble family. So, he did not deserve such a son, and if he became the adopted son of aristocrats, he would be able to get to the right place. So, it was not a rejection of his roots. Ray, shocked by what he heard, raised her hand to her mouth. Her father, holding his hand to his chin, wondered if this was true, adding that everyone here guessed about it because Chiron is completely different from his parents. Chiron, shocked by what he heard, opened his mouth. Bischoff looked away and wondered if this statement was a rejection of his son. Suddenly, Chiron leaned towards his father and screamed, asking what he was doing. How could he say such a thing without discussing it? Vincent then turned away in shame and said that since he was an adult, he should have known about it. But as soon as the boy asked if he really thought he didn't know, the man turned around in shock. Chiron, lowering his head, said that the only reason he didn't ask him about it was because a person can only have two real parents. He dreamed of this and then screamed, asking if he really wanted to have 6 of them now. The man's eyebrows furrowed in shock at what he heard. Tears began to form in his eyes, and he screamed that he just didn't want him to give up on his dream because of him. Suddenly, Chiron closed his eyes and screamed loudly, asking who was abandoning her, adding that he would try and eventually he would have opportunities. But tears streamed down his face, and Chiron asked if his father had ever thought about his feelings, who would want to be abandoned by their parents twice. Vincent took his son's hand with shaking hands and asked himself sadly what he had done. Suddenly, he hugged Chiron and screamed that it was his fault, adding that he would never abandon him. Tears streamed down his face, and he begged his son to forgive him because he was his everything. As they hugged, everyone present could not take their eyes off them. Vincent said that the things they do for their children sometimes hurt them, and Clump frowned sadly and said that being a parent is really hard, but they also sometimes suffer trying to raise children without anyone's help. Bischoff put his hand on his head and looked at his father. Then he turned his gaze to his son. He saw that tears were coming out of Rian's eyes. After a short pause, Bischoff looked at his father again and said that he heard that there were some special agreements in the Alphea's Magic Academy and his father could negotiate them, but that his father asked in surprise if he really thought that an old man like him could do anything. How could he convince these stubborn alphas? But when the man said that he heard that they were in his debt, Clump pressed his lips in confusion. After a few seconds, a wide smile appeared on his face, and he said that for a man of principle to the core, stubbornly pushing is the best method. Bischoff, hearing this, chuckled and replied that he did the same when he handed over the position of the head of the family to him. His family mansion was swallowed by a huge shadow from the clouds. 3 days later, until Rian left for the fencing school, thanks to Ojin's mercy, his family was able to stay in their house. Deep in the night, they sat and talked. Before going to bed, Vincent stretched his hand towards his son, continuing to apologize to him, to which Chiron said to himself that he was worried about how many years he could last this time. For the first time, he and Rian had free time. They slept in the same room. Rian leaned towards his friend. Chiron looked at the guy with a wide smile in response, and then 3 days later, Chiron stood in front of the Ojin family's mansion. Hearing sobs, he turned around. Next to him stood Rian, who was crying bitterly and saying that when he got into the carriage, he would have to go to the fencing school, and they truly said goodbye. Wiping away his tears, he screamed, asking why he couldn't enroll next year like him, to which he replied that they didn't even know if he would be accepted on special rights, after which he suggested that they meet during the holidays and also write letters to each other every day. When suddenly, Rian put his hand on his friend's shoulder. With tears in his eyes, he frowned, screaming that he should become a mage, and he would become the strongest knight, and be the sword that would protect him. But before he could finish speaking, Reina punched him in the back of the head and screamed at him to focus on his studies because she was worried about him the most. Then she approached Chiron and told him not to worry and spend time with his family because their grandfather would definitely make sure that he was accepted. Hearing this, the guy bowed and thanked them for their help. The girl looked at her interlocutor with a warm smile on her face, saying to herself that Chiron was a special child, adding that at first she thought he was just a cute younger brother, but he was really a very sensitive boy. Chiron, with his eyebrows drawn together, looked at Reina, and she at one time said to herself that even in such a terrible situation, he did not give up his beliefs. After these thoughts, she smiled even wider and said that maybe when he graduates. But without finishing, Ray stopped talking and asked herself what she was even thinking about. Smiling warmly, she added that he should live in the new world of the Magic Academy. With these thoughts, the girl put her hand on the guy's shoulder and said that it did not matter. After which she suggested trying because he would definitely become a wizard, to which he asked to take care of Rian. After that, the twins got into the carriage. Chiron opened the doors to another carriage where his family was sitting. The horses galloped quick. The two carriages raced along the road. Chiron, sitting inside, suddenly heard someone calling him. Then he leaned out of the window. Rian looked out of the window of his carriage and shouted loudly that when he got to the Magic Academy, he should tear everyone there apart. Chiron smiled widely from what he heard. The guy looked at his friend with warmth in his eyes and shouted for him to do the same at the fencing academy. The meeting of these two passionate young men will go down in history as the beginning of an incident that destroyed the structure of this world. Both carriages were leaving Ojin's mansion. On the roof of the building, there was a nest with chicks. Their mother flew into the sky. Bright rays of the sun fell on the territory of the Alphea's Magic Academy. The man nervously tapped his finger on the table. Clump, raising one eyebrow, said that since he had been thinking for half an hour, he thought he could expect a positive answer from him. Sitting opposite him was Alpheus, who replied that despite being his good friend for 50 years, he could not accept his request. Sunlight was streaming into the office through the huge windows, and the old man, hearing this, shouted, asking what he had just said. Did he know how much he had suffered because of him in his youth? Adding that given his empty self-praise, there must be a good reason for this. Alpheus poured some tea into a cup and said that anyway, special agreements were not created as a backup plan for nobles. Many applications came every year. But special agreements also had their own requirements. Frowning with displeasure, Clamp said to himself that he was a very harmful old man, making him wait, but did not even think for a second. After these thoughts, he laughed maliciously and said that this boy was different from the others, which made the boy raise his eyebrows in surprise, saying that it sounded interesting because he had not seen such an expression on his face for a long time. The old man folded his arms and smiled widely as he said that he was not asking him to accept some strange child. On the contrary, he was his youngest grandson's friend, and he was truly something. After which, he asked if he knew what he thought when he first saw him. Suddenly, Clump's eyes lit up and he said that he thought he was looking at him when he was young. Hearing this, Alpheus sipped some tea and asked if he was so talented. Why didn't he come here himself? Apparently, he had some problems. Frowning, Clump replied that yes, there was a huge problem. He was not a noble. And when Mui asked if that was really the case, the old man raised one eyebrow in surprise. Alpheus held a cup of tea in his hand and asked if it was a fair-haired child with blue eyes. Clump then told his first impression of Chiron. When he said that even if he had to die, he would never regret becoming his friend. The old man frowned, saying that the boy spoke very well. He thought that he was a really smart child who knew how to manipulate adults. But when he offered to adopt him, he remembered Chiron holding his parents' hands and saying that telling him to give up his roots was like telling him to go and die. Leaving his memories behind, Clump slapped his face and shouted, asking what his interlocutor thought about it, to refuse to become a noble. Alpheus raised his hand to his chin and said that he understood the truth of cause and effect. Then the old man lowered his hand and replied, "Yes, without a cause, there is no effect." But not many people realize this and go astray. A new opportunity may always appear, but when people give up their beliefs, they end up losing everything. They will never give up what they believe is right. The man stood on a platform crumbling beneath him. Mir stroked his beard in silence. When suddenly, lowering his hand, he said that the fact that the man does not make concessions means that everyone can consider his opinion correct or condemn it, and he considers this dangerous. Hearing this, the old man's lips turned down. Suddenly, he asked if he still hadn't forgiven himself, causing him to look down. Clump continued to say that he had done what he had to, taught so many talented people, and then asked if it was time to let go of this grudge, to which Alpheus laughed and said that he was saying that he should forgive himself, but that was arrogant. He looked out the window, explaining that the reason he taught children was because he didn't want anyone like him to appear. With a frown, he added that if this child was like him, as he said, there was no guarantee that he wouldn't go down the same terrible path. Clump kept his eyes on his interlocutor, saying that he was a genius that was born once in a century. He was called the light of the Milch family. But one day, he took the wrong road and almost lost everything, but eventually came back. Alpheus, with his hand on his beard, listened to his interlocutor in silence. Leaning towards him, the old man said that of course he did not expect him to be an old-fashioned director in such a remote place. To which he exclaimed that it was heaven itself that helped him back then because a talentless fool became an official third-class swordsman. So now he is worried about the future of the kingdom of Thormia, which made Clamp laugh when suddenly M stood up. Walking to the window, he said that without a cause there is no effect. Hearing this, the old man smiled broadly and asked if this could be fate, adding that given that he knew him, the boy who disappeared 4 years ago had returned. Lowering his head, Alpheus laughed and replied that he did not believe in fate. When suddenly he remembered Chiron and said to himself that however the talent that was hindered by status changed the route for 4 years and now stands right in front of him. Maybe this really is fate. Leaving his memories, the old man turned to the guest and firmly answered that he would receive Chiron. In the spring, 3 months later, a carriage was driving along a country road. Chiron was going down the stairs and calling his parents. He was 17 years old, and with a smile on his face, he said that he would definitely return. Hugging his mother, the guy said that he would write to her. After which he asked if his hair looked good because he had never worn one like this. So he was a little embarrassed. To which she replied that Miss Reina said that short hair was now in fashion among the nobility, and he should also behave naturally. When suddenly his father raised his hand to his mouth, asked if he had forgotten anything. Then Chiron waved his hands negatively, saying that he was 17, to which he replied that since he would not, then he would do it. After these words, Vincent kissed his son on the forehead. Then he hugged him tightly, saying that he was proud of him. The bright sun illuminated everything around, and Chiron asked if everything would be okay because the head of the family said that he would find a house for them in the city, to which the man asked discontentedly if he was a hunter or what, adding that he was attached to the mountains and fields. After that, he seeing his son off and said that no matter how much he refused the Ogent family's expenses for him, they continued to impose them on them, to which Chiron, walking ahead, said to himself that his admission to the academy could be a holiday for the whole village. But his father did not tell anyone about this. Obviously, he refused to live in the city because he did not want to be able to blackmail him with his family. At the carriage, they were met by Temirin, who took off his hat and said that they would accompany the guide to the academy. Having got into the carriage, Chiron waved his hand and shouted that he would return soon. Thus began his first day at the Magic Academy. The parents watched the carriage driving away into the distance. Chiron and the butler were sitting inside. After a while, the old man took hold of the door handle. He then helped Chiron down, saying that they had arrived at the Alphea's Magic Academy. The boy looked at the huge gate in front of him. Holding a suitcase in his hands, the old man said that the tuition fees and materials were on it, and the boy's task was only to study well, to which he thanked him for his help. Nodding gratefully, he added that from now on he could not thank him. After which he thanked him for deeming him worthy of it without raising his head. Chiron added that he would never forget his kindness. When suddenly he opened his eyes in shock when he heard the butler say that no matter how talented a peasant is, he will always remain a peasant and will never become better than a nobleman. Smiling in confusion, Chiron looked at the old man when suddenly Timon said that not everyone is given such an opportunity, causing Chiron to raise his eyebrows in surprise. The butler smiled warmly and continued to say that when he entered the school, many nobles would look at him with distrust, but he must be persistent because he will be able to endure and reach the end. After that, they went to the academy to register, and the guy firmly said that he will definitely become a mage. Alphea's Magic Academy is a place called the Cradle of Geniuses. Chiron smiled warmly, wondering what he will learn here and who he will meet. The men in overalls proudly raised their heads and shouted that they will do their best to serve them. Chiron along with Temirin walked to the academy. Inside, the old man handed the suitcase to the guy and said that it was time for him to go, and if he needed anything, he should contact him, but thanked him for something. After the butler left, Chiron looked around and wondered who would meet him, whether he should look around while he waited. When suddenly he saw a board with classes and said to himself that they use a 10-class system here, a total of 420 students, of which 30 are in the graduating class, graduate from here every year. Surprised, Chiron raised his eyebrows, asking himself if there really were only 10 classes, when suddenly someone called out to him from behind. The guy turned around in shock. Not far from him stood Alpheus, who said with a smile on his face that they had met before. Without thinking twice, Chiron bowed and thanked him for that occasion, to which he, putting his hand on his back, replied that everything was fine because they would still have time to talk and now it was time to walk. He took a step forward and explained that Chiron needed to take an entrance test, adding that there was no need to worry because it was just a simple assessment that would determine his class. Out of the corner of his eye, the old man looked at the guy and asked if he knew how to enter the spirit zone, to which he happily replied that he could. Hearing this, Alpheus's eyes showed surprise, and he said to himself that this guy had discovered the spirit zone on his own, and it would be great to teach him from a young age, adding that he hadn't recognized the diamond when it was right in front of his eyes. But even though it was late, he had to teach him the basics. There would only be children in the hall for the entrance test, so if they came early, it would ruin his reputation. The academy was illuminated by the rays of the evening sun, and the old man asked if the guy wanted to see the school. The doors to a long corridor opened in front of them. A guy passed by Chiron reading 3 books at the same time which were flying around him, and he wondered what that was, adding that something strange had just passed by when suddenly Alpheus stopped and said that this was the office where the classes were held and the beginners class from the 10th to the 8th grade. Chiron looked at the children who were flying under the ceiling with his mouth open. The children who were not flying passed them books from the balcony. Someone was playing games with magic. Chiron looked around in surprise, saying that everyone here uses magic, to which the old man replied that this is exactly the case, but the place they are going to next is a little different. So they came to the highest ranking class. The guy looked around, saying to himself that the atmosphere here is different because everyone around him is his age, and then asked himself what they were talking about so animatedly. One of the magicians pointed his index finger and told his comrade that a large amount of energy would reduce the atmosphere to below freezing. Wouldn't the condensation of the coolant be more effective? However, the disadvantage is that the reverse reaction would be accelerated. How about if they redirected the time scale instead of energy? Hearing this, Chiron's mouth opened in shock, wondering what they were talking about, why he couldn't understand them even though they spoke the same language. Suddenly, a huge explosion was heard behind him. Turning around, he saw a guy who immediately greeted the principal, who said that there seemed to be a problem. Chiron looked at the other students in surprise who weren't reacting, wondering if they didn't care at all. And the guy continued to say that he was conducting an experiment to amplify sound, but an error appeared at the output, to which the old man advised him to check the homogeneity of the electricity because it seemed that the balance of the input and output was wrong. Then the guy showed a thumbs up and exclaimed that he would try again, to which Chiron said to himself in surprise that the principal was not stopping him. And moreover, this student would try again as if he was in another world. There were many powerful future magicians around Chiron. Suddenly, a girl with red hair walked behind him. It was an adult Amy. All the guys looked after her with their mouths open. White feathered birds were flying above the Magic Academy. Chiron asked in surprise if this was really a notice board. There was a notice board on the wall. Suddenly, the guy saw that in the 4th class, which had 42 people, Amy Carmus was in first place, after which he asked himself if this was not a first-class noble woman. He raised his eyebrows in surprise and thought that this was amazing because all the people listed here had the same abilities as him. But if you think about it, she towered over them. Cold sweat was running down his cheek and Chiron was saying to himself that he wanted to try competing too since he would be studying from the beginning again in this place. His eyes suddenly sparkled at the thought that he could take first place in the rankings when he suddenly heard a loud shout that called out to Amy to come along. The boy turned around and asked himself, "Amy?" She meant Carmus, the first in the middle class. When suddenly horror appeared in his eyes. He saw a girl with long red hair walking towards her. At the same time, Chiron remembered the skirmish with her servants. The girl herself with her arms folded across her chest was watching this. During the fight, Chiron defeated those who attacked him. Seeing this, Amy pointed her finger at him and screamed furiously, asking where he learned to cast spells since he was an ordinary commoner. Currently the girl was walking forward looking at the floor when suddenly she looked towards Chiron. The guy immediately turned away and Amy was called out by her friend. Lowering his head, Chiron said to himself that he hoped that she had not noticed him. The girls passed by when suddenly Amy's friend raising her eyebrows looked at the guy and said that he was perfect, after which she asked if he was really a new student, adding that he was a little old for this. While she was thinking about this, Amy, without turning around, said that it was strange because she had already seen him somewhere. Hearing this, her friend frowned in surprise and exclaimed, asking if she was really interested in him, adding that she herself said that she did not care about guys at all, to which she replied that it was not that, he just looked familiar. As they walked down the corridor, the guys stared after them. Amy Carmi ranks first in the middle class as the most popular girl in the middle class. She constantly rejected the confession of the seniors and juniors from her classmates. She is the most exemplary among all the exemplary students. Everyone in this academy with blushes on their cheeks could not take their eyes off her. The only person who knows about her dark past is going to enter this academy. Chiron was shaking from the memories of her. Alpheus, noticing this, asked if he was cold, to which he replied no. The Magic Academy, the third testing area in the area, separate from everyone there was a small building. Chiron and the old man went inside and the old man, seeing the children, said that he saw that they were not finished yet. Then he pointed his finger at a child in the distance and told Chiron to carefully watch what he was doing. In the center of the hall in front of a committee of 5 people stood a boy. After this, Alpheus pointed to the symbols on the floor and explained that when the boy entered the state of the spirit, he would feel that the letters on the floor had changed. He should say what he felt and then the committee would determine the size, strength, mobility, and position of his state of the spirit. Smiling broadly, he looked at Chiron, adding that he would only need to answer the teacher's questions honestly. To which he firmly answered, "Good," while saying to himself that this was quite interesting. The man on the committee, with a smile on his face, looked at the boy and asked if he could do magic, to which he answered, "Yes." Kami, raising his eyebrows, said that he could lift things into the air, after which he was asked to enter the state of the spirit. A few seconds later, the boy, closing his eyes, said that he had entered. Then the man, raising his hand to the cat, asked what number was the farthest. After thinking for a while, Kami answered that this number was 6. After which the first member of the committee wrote it down. At this point, Alpheus turned to Chiron and explained that the number 6 meant that the diameter of the condition was 6m. Then the next member of the committee asked what color the boy felt the most, to which he replied, "Red." adding that he thought he had entered a red world. Upon hearing this, the man wrote down that Kami was a divergent type, meaning that a person is prone to large bursts of activity, and said that this also meant that the condition was quite large for his age. A few seconds later, a woman asked the boy if he saw a huge tower, to which he replied that it was on the left, and the form wrote down, "Right hemisphere." Then a girl with purple hair asked what temperature he felt, to which Kami, raising his head, replied that it was quite hot in here, and he was sweating a little. After which, the form wrote down variables. After this, the girl said that the boy could now leave. After Kami left, Sina looked at the form and said that the students this year were amazing. To which the man next to her replied that it was true. For example, the size of that boy Mike's fortune is a full 12 m. So, he thinks that their students are getting better every year. The committee member wrote in the final evaluation that the boy uses his spirit zone well, but his endurance is a little behind, and then said that Chiron is next. Then Alpheus put his hand on the boy's shoulder and told him not to be afraid and to show his abilities, to which he replied that he would try. The man put his hand to his chin and said to himself that this is the boy who passed thanks to the special selection that the director mentioned, and the girl next to him looking at the form thought that this is a strange choice because the boy is already quite old, and also he seems to have borrowed the name of the Ojin house. Is his family not famous? The form stated that Chiron was 17 years old and his origin was a guest of the Ojin household. The girl, without raising her head, was thinking that perhaps they had simply recognized his talent late and maybe he was good, but he would be quickly buried in this school when suddenly her comrade asked if Chiron could cast spells. Stepping into the center of the hall, Chiron replied, "No, he had not studied anything yet." To which the committee members said that even if he had not studied anything, he should be able to do some things. Alpheus watched this from the side and said to himself that this is exactly what they would think because magic is a process of releasing knowledge from the mind. Noble children are taught a lot and they naturally come to use magic. But this child does not have such knowledge at all. While he was thinking about this, the committee member asked Chiron while in the circle to enter the spirit zone, after which he asked if he could enter it at all. Lowering his head, Chiron quietly replied that he would try. Exhaling heavily, the committee members thought that this was very good, and it seemed that this was not a severe case of nepotism. Closing his eyes, Chiron began to walk in the spirit zone. Suddenly, the space around him changed. Opening his eyes, the guy raised his eyebrows in shock and said to himself, "So that's how it looked." The man looked at him and asked him to name the farthest number. Chiron stood silently in place, even when he was called out. Then the woman turned to her comrades and said that he seemed embarrassed. Alpheus smiled and told the boy that he just needed to answer honestly because they were not comparing him to the others, but simply looking for the best way to teach. After a short pause, Chiron, without moving from his place, answered that he saw the number, but so far away that he could not make it out. To which the committee member asked in surprise what he meant by he could not make it out because he should not see it. He needed to feel it. After which Chiron explained that he did not mean that he felt it, but the number was very long and even now it continued to grow. Hearing this, the man exhaled heavily and asked himself if this was serious, after which he said that this was normal, so he should start with the first digits he saw. Lowering his head, Chiron thought. In his mind, he saw an incredibly huge number in front of him. It began with the digits 3.1400s. As soon as Chiron named this number, the members of the commission were very surprised, and the girl with purple hair asked if he was sure, adding that among the established numbers, there were no 3.1400s. Confusedly knitting her eyebrows, the guy replied that this is what he sees. The girl did not take her eyes off Chiron and asked herself if this was true, adding that of course there were several cases when he showed the number pi. This means that the size of the fortune exceeds the limits they set. But did his fortune really exceed 30 m? When suddenly the woman raising her eyebrows asked what color he felt the most. Without thinking twice, Chiron looking around answered blue. Everything here is painted blue. The members of the commission looked at each other after hearing this, and whispered that if it was blue, it was a convergent type. Was his fortune still that great? Because a convergent type meant that durability was better than the size of the fortune, the opposite of a divergent type. Alpheus himself opened his mouth in surprise and said to himself that he now understood why Clamp had been so adamant, because it was a talent that did not match the level. The old man's eyes were full of surprise. They wrote on the form that the guy was a convergent. Then they wrote on another line, both hemispheres. After that, the woman looked at Chiron and asked how many spheres were hovering around him. Chiron looked at the brightly burning spheres around him and asked himself if she was really asking about these things, adding that there was no need to count each one because he could feel them. He stood in a large magic circle and answered 867. Shock appeared in the woman's eyes after hearing this. After a short pause, she wrote 86.7% in the concentration line. Alpheus, hearing this, frowned tensely and said to himself that this was a little dangerous. The girl with purple hair adjusted her glasses. Putting them in her hand, she asked how cold the boy was now. Chiron, slightly raising his head, answered that it was very cold here and he was frozen, to which the girl answered as expected. With this information, she began to write the final grade. After a few seconds, the girl finished writing and said that it was a good job. The woman smiled widely and said that now they need to confer on which classes he will be placed in, so all applicants should wait in the corridor. Hearing this, Chiron and the other children began to leave. The last one to leave, Chiron began to close the doors. A second later they closed. Immediately after that, the committee began to look at each other, saying that he was a very interesting student. But as a 17-year-old boy, the size of the spirit zone can exceed 30 m, and the size of the state exceeds his concentration. But this student's concentration is 86.7%. The committee member, raising one eyebrow, added that, moreover, this is pure concentration without using any enhancing skills. Could he really be a monk who trained in the forest for a long time? The girl with purple hair stood up from her seat when suddenly a voice from the side asked if he could accidentally lie. The man with a malicious smile on his face said that his comrades should think for themselves in the spirit zone with a concentration of 90% and a diameter of 30 m for a 17-year-old boy who does not know magic. This is nonsense. What if he just told them big numbers? The girl turned to look at him and said that he seemed to have forgotten that there was no point in lying to students, because if they got into the upper level classes, they would not understand the curriculum, not to mention that they would not be able to give tests. Why would students lie like that if they came here to study? And what's more, even the teachers seemed to have forgotten that the number pi was displayed as an error code. At this time, Chiron was sitting next to the children. Sina continued to say that this was not something a simple student would say for the sake of attracting attention, causing Thad to frown in displeasure. Suddenly, Alpheus approached them and asked where he would be sent. Sina, a certified 6th rank mage, extended her hand and replied that the 6th grade was where they studied the development of the spirit zone and its theory, and the 5th grade was where they began to teach real magic. But she thought that this student's spirit zone was fully developed, and therefore, with a wide smile, she added that the 5th class was recommended when suddenly Thad said that he objected. Thad, a certified 6th rank mage, stepped forward and said that he was a 17-year-old boy who didn't even know magic, and if they sent him to a high class, he would only become arrogant and cause them trouble. So, he believed that they should teach him the basics. Hearing this, Sina turned to her comrade and said that it might be so, but not all students were like him. As soon as Thad heard this, he showed his magical energy and shouted at her to be honest, that she wanted to send him to the 5th class since she was in charge of it in order to get this student. To which she showed her power in response, and shouted asking what was wrong with her wanting to teach a talented student. While the two were arguing, the other committee members approached Alpheus and said that Mr. Thad was right. He was talented but still a young student, and then asked how about teaching him step by step starting from the 10th grade. The woman next to him looked down and said that if they sent him to the basic class with the little ones, he might lose his motivation to study, and then asked what if they postponed the placement and just kept an eye on him. Then the 3rd committee member, looking at Alpheus, said that he thought the 7th grade would be suitable. It was a high class that taught the basics of the spirit zone, and if this child was truly talented, he could easily transfer to a higher grade. Hearing this proposal, Alpheus put his hand to his beard and said that he was right. Lowering his hand, he firmly said that Chiron would be studying in the 7th grade. In the Magic Academy, there is a 10-class system. Depending on the grade, students are distributed across a network of classes of varying difficulty levels. They are divided into 3 groups. Elementary classes from 10th to 8th, where students focus on developing their spirit zone, where children were taught in 99% of cases. High classes from 7th to 4th, where students gain knowledge of using magic and spirit zone, where Chiron peers were most often taught. And finally, the graduating classes from 3rd to 1st, where rigorous training takes place to prepare professional magicians, where magicians who are several years older than Chiron are trained. The Magic Academy was brightly illuminated by the rays of the sun. On the student's chest was the number 7. The female magicians looked after him in surprise. Chiron walked forward in student clothes. In the classroom, the teacher announced that they had a new student today. The students whispered among themselves, saying that he was immediately enrolled in the middle class, and it seems that he is quite adult but very handsome. In front of them, Chiron stood at the board saying that he hoped that they would get along. Everyone present was very surprised by his appearance. Chiron looked at his future comrades and thought that he had finally entered the academy. The Magic Academy occupies 75.425,000 of a kilometer of mountainous territory, including the dormitory. It has more than 33 buildings and 40 training centers. Although leaving its territory is only allowed during vacations, this does not cause inconvenience since everything necessary is in the school. Classes end at 5 o'clock, and after that students have free time. They go to the open 24-hour library. Students also form study groups with similar interests with other students, feeding their thirst for learning. All of this was the driving force in the creation of a prestigious school. Chiron, looking at the book, said to himself that, as expected, the classes are difficult. There are many subjects that require a lot of knowledge, and even nobles who have studied since childhood are not easy now. With glowing eyes, he absorbed the knowledge, saying to himself that he will do everything possible and catch up with them. The basis of knowledge according to the Chironeological order of history that he remembered. All the knowledge of the world accumulated gradually. Behind Chiron, there was a road of books. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, and the teacher said that the morning classes were over and everyone worked hard. Hearing this, Chiron sighed with relief and said to himself that after lunch, practices and classes dedicated to the spirit zone will begin. But the schedule does not say where they will be held. He looked at those present in the class and wondered who to ask this when suddenly he saw his peer. Approaching the girl with pink hair, the guy asked if she knew where to go to the training camp today. Hearing this, the girl turned around in fear and exclaimed, asking if it was really him, to which he said to himself that she was very shy and for some reason he felt calmer. A few seconds later, the girl approached Chiron and said that he must not know yet. Practice today is at the second joint training ground. Chiron, hearing this, asked what it meant. Then the student explained that twice a week all the middle classes train together, and today there will be a briefing, from which the guy tensely drew together his eyebrows and asked himself if it was really possible together with all the middle classes. At the second joint training ground, many students were entering inside. A girl with red hair passed by those present, whom everyone asked to sit with them. Amy, together with her friend, calmly walked forward, and everyone present watched her with admiration. Chiron saw the huge crowd around her and said to himself that she was incredibly popular. If possible, he definitely didn't want to run into her, but alas, they had classes together twice a week. The guy didn't take his eyes off the crowd, adding that even if that was the case, since she was the first in the rankings, she would soon be promoted to the graduating class, adding that the upper-class-men and lower-class-men actively conversed and had strict rules, after which he wondered if he could stay in the shadows, when suddenly Athela, a teacher, a specialist in the use of the spirit zone, a certified 6th rank mage, folded her hands and greeted all the middle classes. She looked at the students present and said that there should be students who got into this class only this year. But she also saw many familiar faces, and today there was a newcomer in their class. Hearing this, Chiron was very confused, saying that this was a very dangerous turn of events. Suddenly, the teacher asked him to stand up and greet everyone with a smile on her face, causing shock to appear in the boy's eyes. He nervously swallowed his saliva. Amy's friend was looking at him intently. A few seconds later, Chiron stood up from his seat and introduced himself. After that, everyone began to applaud him. Chiron breathed his last in shame, screaming in his head that he didn't know anything. Amy's friend clasped her hands and exclaimed, asking if this was the guy she saw yesterday, adding that she thought his name was Chiron. The noblewoman looked away, saying to herself that she was hearing his name for the first time, but he looked familiar, and she was sure she had saved many faces with her red eyes. Another student suddenly leaned over to her friend and asked if she really knew him, adding that according to her sources, the teachers were very focused on him. She folded her arms and added that he was said to have done extremely well on the entrance exam, causing Amy's friend to exclaim that she liked him even more now. As they were talking, the noblewoman's eyes lit up. Her hair suddenly stood on end. She remembered how she had fought Chiron many years ago. Amy had looked at him with blazing eyes and screamed, asking where he had learned this magic since he was just a commoner. This caused tears to appear in Chiron's eyes. The girl shook as she left her memories. The Karmas family is considered a generation of geniuses, and it is said that their unique ability, red eyes, is only passed on to the heirs of the Karmais. The girl pulled the bowstring, which allows one to accurately remember specific events. At that very second, the arrow hit the center of the target perfectly. Suddenly, another arrow split it into two, making the concept of learning meaningless to them. Both of these arrows were fired by Amy Karmas, who as the youngest daughter was recognized as the most talented of the entire family. She completely inherited Karmas' genius. She was a master at playing intellectual board games. Suddenly, she stopped and her opponent asked in surprise what was wrong. Suddenly, Amy stood up and said that she was bored and tired of everything. She took a gang of minions with her and said to herself that her family had nothing to do with her efforts. She had achieved a lot without their help and could do whatever she wanted whenever she wanted. Under her orders, her subordinates beat up people on the street. Watching this, Amy enjoyed it. But one day, her life turned upside down. Her subordinates were defeated by Chiron. Everything changed the moment she accidentally met a Christian boy in an alley. Tears poured from the boy's eyes. Currently, Chiron was nodding his head in confusion. Leaving her memories, the girl shook. Her friend suddenly turned around and asked her in fear if everything was okay, to which she exclaimed that her shoes were just uncomfortable. Turning away, Amy said to herself that she didn't believe it because the red eyes' memories couldn't be wrong. She thought he was a noble, but he was that commoner all this time. She glared at Chiron, asking herself how this guy got into the Magic Academy. At that same second, the girl looked down at the book because for her, her past was a dark, shameful secret. Putting her hand to her face, Amy screamed in her head that she wanted to die. Her eyes were full of horror, and she thought about how she had cleaned everything so that not a single detail would remind her of the past. After which, she asked herself if it was true that he didn't remember her. Memories from 5 years ago flashed through her head, during which she mocked Chiron along with her henchmen. Suddenly, Amy imagined Chiron smilingly telling everyone that she was not who she claimed to be. Waving his hand, he added that 5 years ago, she was hanging around with street thugs and that he had no reason to lie since all the teachers trusted him. And then asked if they really thought that was all. Of course not. As soon as Chiron learned that Amy was called heartless, he raised his hand to his face and told her that she was actually very interested in guys since she tried to undress him. When suddenly the girl tore a page out of her textbook, she clutched the sheet tightly in her hand, saying to herself that she would never allow such a misunderstanding, so she had to prevent it. At this time, Chiron was slightly shivering. The teacher raised her hand and asked the class what spirit zone was, to which she was immediately given the answer that it was the mental state of a magician. There was a huge magic seal in the center of the hall, and Atella said that it was true. It was the conscious mental state of a magician, his first type, the form of a sphere, since it was the easiest to focus on. Suddenly, the girl's eyes lit up and she added that in practice it could be ineffective. Then she stood in the magic circle, which immediately reacted to her, and said that she would show them on the visible state. From what he saw, Chiron opened his mouth in shock and exclaimed that this was it. He could see her eye state with his own eyes. The teacher's visible spirit zone spread out in diameter by 10 meters, after which she explained that this was the basic form of the spirit zone, a sphere. As she said earlier, in practice, it was barely applicable. Having said this, the girl snapped her fingers and said that she would show a simple example. Not far from her, A magic target appeared and Ithella added that she would use magic to hit the target. Standing in the magic circle, she looked at the target, saying that the diameter of her state was 10 m, but the target was 20 m away. So, she used a fireball, a fire type of magic. Chiron folded his hands and excitedly said to himself that he would finally see himself use magic. A small fireball appeared above the teacher's finger. The girl stretched out her hand and asked if she could hit it. After saying this, she released the fireball at the target. But after flying 10 m, the fire disappeared, which the students immediately noticed. And Ithella explained that most often magic is unable to go beyond the zone, so it only maintains its form inside the spirit state. After saying this, she lowered her hand and added that they can expand the area in the direction of the target just like now. At the same second, the shape of the spirit state area stretched to the target. The teacher hit the target with the next fire projectile, saying that they had reached the goal. The 7th grade students opened their mouths in surprise, and the students of the higher grades who were watching them said that they were very cute. Chiron applauded in admiration, saying to himself that he did not even know that it was possible to change the shape of the spirit state area when suddenly Ithella said that this method has a big drawback, which made the boys frown in disappointment, asking what was wrong with it. Then the teacher created a system screen and said that changing the shape of their state requires great concentration in a real battle when every second counts. Constantly changing the state of the spirit is simply ineffective. 4 forms of the state of the spirit appeared on the screen, and the girl added that this is why they use it in 4 forms. These are 4 ways to form the state of the spirit. A polygon formed in the air, and the teacher said that they would start with a defensive form, which was a cube and prevented the spirit from being destroyed by an attack. A polyhedron appeared around her, and she raised her hand, adding that the more edges the higher the defensive function. After saying this, Ithella waved her hand, creating a star shape around herself, an attack shape, thanks to which one can catch the movement of the target. This shape is most useful when fighting a large number of enemies. Then she waved her hand in the other direction, creating a target shape designed for long-range combat. However, it is not very good against a fast-moving target. This shape was 2 lines intersecting in the center. The distance between the ends and the center was large, so it was difficult to turn. But the main thing to worry about when using it is the speed of rotation. The students looked at each other, whispering if she really thought they could do it, and Chiron watched the teacher carefully, thinking that with a similar method, it would be possible to use a 10 m diameter spirit state in real battles. After a short pause, Ithella folded her hands and said finally the evasion form. It was no secret that even 5th grade students had a hard time using it successfully, so she would start with an example. The girl sitting behind Chiron smiled mockingly and asked if this meant that if they could do it, they would immediately get into the advanced classes, adding that in the 8th grade she had perfect grades for using the spirit state, so it would be a piece of cake. But before she could finish speaking, the teacher used the evasion form. The students opened their mouths in shock at what they saw. Chiron frowned in surprise. The girl's spirit state had gone beyond her body. It was in the form of a small ball located a few meters away from its owner. Chiron couldn't take his eyes off this spectacle, saying to himself that he didn't understand because the spirit zone is the complete mental state of the magician. After which he asked himself if it was possible to separate thoughts from the body. And now he was very interested in what was in the center of it. Suddenly the teacher began to control the spirit zone. She twirled it around herself with a movement of her hand, explaining that the form of evasion is insanely difficult to use. So much so that only specially trained magicians do it. Its advantage is that while the magician is not in the center, the spirit zone has no movement restrictions, and thus the need for instant use disappears. The range of influence is infinitely huge, and since in the form of evasion, spells are immediately aimed at the enemy, there is no need to aim yourself. The students behind Chiron began to exchange glances, asking how their teacher does something like this in a jiffy. Because it is difficult to breathe in the spirit zone, magicians of the 6th rank are on a completely different level. Chiron looked at Ithella, who was adjusting her glasses, and thought that behind her gentle appearance, there was amazing skill when suddenly the girl asked if they would be upset if they missed practice in the first lesson because the person who won first place in speed shooting. Before she could finish speaking, the students began to raise their hands and shout loudly. The teacher said that this was a 4th grade student, Amy Carmus, so she should go out to demonstrate it to everyone. Then Amy's friend turned to her and said that now she again deserved another stellar demonstration, and all the boys would fall at her feet as soon as they saw her. But Amy looked at the floor with horror in her eyes. Cold sweat poured down her face, and she said to herself that she did not want to be the center of attention now. One of the 4 forms of the spirit zone. This is the form of the goal. The advantage of this cross is the effectiveness at long distances. But if the appearance of moving targets, it becomes useless. Also, a large number of targets makes it useless. But if this cross is supported by someone who can both rotate the zone and control the spirit zone at high speed, then everything becomes different. Rays of fire pierced the targets. Amy suddenly raised her hand. Her balls flew out from her hand. She was an irresistible force for enemies at a long distance. The students discussed Amy with admiration, saying that usually the participants in the speed shooting training use all 4 forms, but a high school girl always takes first place using only the form of the target. Chiron froze with his mouth open in surprise. Although he was a beginner, he could tell that her technique was inimitable. Amy hit her targets not only by rotating the zone while being motionless, but also swept away everything in her path. The girl destroyed all the targets in one fell swoop. Amy, with her arms outstretched, was calm. Her expression said that she had full freedom of action. The student put his hands behind his head and said that if he could date a high school girl, his life would be completely different. Chiron heard this and understood perfectly why boys were crazy about her. He turned his head and asked himself why such an elegant and incredible girl was communicating with bandits. Soon a circle of runes appeared in the arena. Then Amy's result was announced. The girl went to her seat. He raised his head and looked at Chiron. Chiron became nervous and frowned when he saw this. All the students around him opened their mouths in surprise and frowned. Amy immediately turned away, realizing that many understood who she was looking at. The girl sweated in horror. She simply could not help but look at the guy who irritated her. Chiron trembled. At the same time, everyone was discussing the fact that he was familiar with the high school girl. The guy and the girl looked at each other. Now they were sure that they remembered each other. Amy turned away and bowed her head, realizing that if Chiron spread rumors about her past, she would get into trouble. She needed to shut him up somehow. Frowning, she mentally said that she needed to calm down because she was the best student in the academy. Even if he said something, no one would believe him. One awkward movement and unnecessary misunderstandings would arise. Seriel approached her friend and asked if something had happened in the visible zone because she was all red. After the demonstration, the classes split up for practice. Ithella passed by the 7th grade students and said that they would start with a protective form. Chiron closed his eyes and bowed his head, mentally saying that he should feel how he was compressing and compacting his consciousness. The barrier was compressed when the spirit zone was compacted and a structure was created. Then the boundaries were raised to prevent destruction. Chiron opened his eyes wide, realizing that he might have succeeded. Looking at the platform, he mentally said that until he sees it, he won't be able to be sure of it, and it would be easier if he could use the visible zone. Chiron went to the teacher and asked if he could use the visible zone. Looking at the platform, Ithella said that the seniors should do everything first. The teacher smiled, saying that since no one uses the platform, he can try first. Seriel touched his friend's hand and told her to look at the visible zone, which the newcomer entered. Amy spat out all the drinks she had just drunk. The girl turned to her friend, saying that an ordinary 7th grader can't do anything, so why did he climb up there? Ruins lit up in the visible zone. Chiron stood in the center. He closed his eyes, concentrating his mana. He suddenly opened his eyes. The barrier parted from the guy's body. This was his spirit zone. The students opened their mouths in surprise, seeing such a large spirit zone. The barrier diameter counter began to change on the screen. Chiron raised his head. He thought about how his spirit zone at the entrance exam could not be measured. Chiron raised his hands. The screen showed that the diameter had reached 20 m. The 5th grade students were shocked. The students raised their heads trying to understand what was happening. Chiron frowned. He could barely stop the barrier from expanding further. His eyes widened in surprise. The boundaries did not rise. The barrier was collapsing, but everything was fine when the boy was training on his own. Chiron began to panic because of it. Amy, who was standing in the crowd, said that he should not succeed the first time. Chiron raised his head and said that his attention would not be shaken by ordinary fear. So, why was the barrier collapsing? The boy's pupil flashed when he said that something must have caused all this. Like a drop falling into water, the boy suddenly realized what the problem was. Chiron was wrong because the teacher showed everything so calmly. They are concentrated when they change the spirit zone, which means that when he tried to reduce it, he also concentrated. It was as if the teacher came out with a circle of spirit zone with a diameter of 10 m. Chiron parted his lips, saying that if the problem was that he was making his spirit zone smaller than it is, then he just needed the normal size. He raised his head and screamed. The boy's barrier began to expand, shocking everyone. A bright light filled the area. The boy's eyes were glowing as he controlled his spirit zone. The boy's diameter indicator began to change rapidly. Amy smiled nervously. Chiron's blue barrier filled the entire area. The students raised their heads trying to see the top of the barrier. At that moment, the diameter indicator reached 41 m. The students standing in front of the area screamed, saying that it was too big. The barrier of the spirit zone was shining brightly. Chiron raised his hands and barely held the barrier. Cracks appeared on the barrier when the boy decided to compress it. The boy's spirit zone began to change its shape. The students froze with their mouths open in surprise. The rooms on the square glowed brightly. Chiron managed to create one of the forms of the barrier. On the very first day, Chiron lowered his hands and turned around. He touched the barrier, amazed. It was as if he was inside a precious stone. Ithella adjusted her glasses and mentally said that the fact that the convergent type excels at defense clearly helped him. But she was still amazed that the guy did it on the first day. Sariel smiled and told her friend that this student really did attract the attention of the teachers. Amy froze with a smile on her face, mentally saying that she shouldn't have forgotten that this bastard was the beginning of her humiliation. Now looking at the guy's face, she thought that someone was definitely helping him. Soon enough, he would be able to catch up with the difference in classes and his influence would only grow. The girl clenched her teeth. Her plans changed. Now she needed to get closer to him.